Every discovery begins with doubt, the quiet, invisible kind that hides between decimals. This one started with a single data point that refused to fit, a flicker in the telescope feed, a shift too smooth to be random, too deliberate to be natural. At first, no one paid attention, but when the same pattern appeared again, across observatories separated by oceans, the whisper became impossible to ignore. The interstellar object known as 3I Atlas, once dismissed as another icy wanderer from beyond our solar system, had changed course, not from collision, not from gravity, but from something else entirely. Scientists ran through every possibility. Solar radiation? No. The light pressure wasn't strong enough. Outgassing? None detected. Instrument error? Ruled out after triple confirmation from Japan's Subaru telescope, the ESA's Gaia system, and NASA's Deep Space Network. The data was real. The object had moved. But here's the part that stopped even the most skeptical astronomers cold. The shift wasn't chaotic. It followed a curve, a perfect, smooth trajectory adjustment, as if something within it had recalculated. And then, days later, it did it again. Each motion tiny, measured, controlled. To the untrained eye, it's just numbers on a graph. But to those who live by physics, those numbers meant one thing. 3I Atlas was violating Newton. The object's orbit around the Sun should have been predictable, immutable, the way all natural bodies move through space. But this one drifted from the model, slowly, silently, as if rewriting its own path. For the first time in decades, the equations that built modern astronomy were failing, not in theory, but in practice. When the first public reports leaked, the response was quiet disbelief. Some said the data was overinterpreted, others said it was coincidence, just a trick of limited observation. But then, the European Space Agency released its own internal briefing, and the wording changed everything. Non-gravitational acceleration confirmed. That phrase, buried deep in a technical note, set off a chain reaction. Because in the language of astrophysics, non-gravitational doesn't just mean strange. It means we have no idea why this is happening. And that's when Avi Loeb entered the picture. The Harvard astrophysicist who sparked controversy years ago with his theory about Oumuamua, another interstellar object that behaved oddly, had been waiting for something like this. Within hours of the data release, his team published an early analysis suggesting the trajectory of 3I Atlas matched no natural propulsion model known. He called it intentional kinematics. Not alien, not artificial, simply intentional. Before we go deeper, pause for a moment, because this is where the story turns from science to something far more human, curiosity and fear. If you're fascinated by what lies beyond our narrow understanding and by how fragile our definitions of normal truly are, then make sure you're part of this journey. Tap that like button, subscribe, and stay awake with us as we drift into the dark between certainty and the unknown. Prepare yourself. We begin. As the news spread, telescopes worldwide pivoted toward the object. The European Southern Observatory began round-the-clock imaging. The Keck Array in Hawaii ran continuous spectral analysis. Each returned the same result, a pattern of brightness that wasn't static. Every few hours, the reflected sunlight from 3I Atlas pulsed, faintly, rhythmically, in a sequence that defied explanation. At first, the pulses seemed random, but statistical modeling revealed structure, intervals repeating with precise ratios like coded intervals in radio telemetry. Even stranger, those intervals aligned with hydrogen's 21 centimeter emission frequency, a fundamental constant used by scientists to communicate across cosmic distances. Coincidence? Possibly, but it was enough to reignite a debate the scientific world had been trying to avoid since 2017. Are we sure we're looking at a rock? Because if it isn't, then we're not just witnessing another interstellar passerby. We're watching something doing something. Within days, the European Space Agency's public feed went silent. NASA's open-access logs flagged the object as restricted observation. The Japanese network cut its last transmission mid-sequence, citing data synchronization maintenance. It felt coordinated, like a curtain quietly being drawn. And yet, outside those agencies, amateur astronomers continued tracking. Small observatories, university instruments, even backyard telescopes contributed data, and what they saw next added a new layer to the mystery. In late-night exposures, 3I Atlas appeared doubled, not broken apart, but mirrored. Two faint reflections, perfectly symmetrical, separated by only a few arc-seconds. The pattern held for 48 minutes, then merged again, leaving no debris, no cloud, no explanation. To the professionals who saw those frames, it wasn't evidence of destruction, it was coordination, a response, or maybe a test, because the timing matched a gap in radar observation, as if it knew when we weren't looking. It shouldn't be possible. But that phrase keeps coming up in every paper, every report, every quiet discussion among those who know how deep the data goes. Whatever 3i Atlas is, it isn't just passing by, it's participating. By the time most of the world moved on to other headlines, a handful of researchers were still staring at that pulse sequence. It repeated every 11 minutes and 18 seconds, perfectly consistent across telescopes separated by thousands of miles. Dr. Avi Loeb's group at the Galileo Project decided to isolate the modulation using their own radio dish at Harvard's Oak Ridge site. When they filtered out background cosmic noise, the pattern sharpened, not random static, but structured amplitude shifts, rising and falling in symmetrical bursts. Someone on the team whispered what everyone else was afraid to say out loud. "This looks engineered." But Loeb refused to jump to conclusions. He's learned how quickly extraordinary claims are ridiculed. Instead, he built a model, a purely physical one, to see if sunlight pressure or electromagnetic coupling could mimic what they were seeing. The simulations failed. Every attempt to reproduce the motion required an internal energy source, a mechanism capable of adjusting thrust in microbursts. And yet, the spectra still showed no signs of exhaust, ionization, or heat plume. It was motion without propulsion, power without fuel, a paradox in plain sight. While Loeb's paper was still under peer review, an encrypted document began circulating among European researchers. It originated from the ESA's internal archive, time-stamped less than 48 hours earlier. Its title, Anomalous Dynamic Response in 3i Atlas, Preliminary Containment. The contents described a secondary object detected trailing 0.04 AU behind the primary, a mass roughly 1/10 its size, moving in lockstep. The language was cautious but unmistakable. Co-orbital pairing confirmed. In simple terms, 3i Atlas was no longer alone. That revelation fractured the quiet coordination between agencies. NASA issued a brief press statement insisting that the object exhibits natural fragmentation behavior. But astronomers who compared the images noticed something chilling. Natural fragments tumble, they drift apart. These two did not. They maintained an exact distance, varying by less than a kilometer across hundreds of thousands of miles. It was orbital choreography, elegant, deliberate, and silent. Behind the scenes, observatories were ordered to throttle their data relays. One European operator later admitted the directive came from above ESA, possibly political. Yet in the vacuum left by official silence, the independent science community filled the gap. Amateurs began compiling a synchronized timeline of light curves, revealing that both objects pulsed at alternating intervals, one brightening as the other dimmed, like binary beacons exchanging rhythm across the void. If this was coincidence, it was the most mathematically improbable coincidence in recorded astronomy. The question no one wanted to ask became unavoidable. Are we being observed in return? At that point, something unexpected happened. 3i Atlas changed again. The latest astrometric solution from the Lowell Observatory showed a minute deceleration, followed by a new acceleration vector angled directly toward the plane of Earth's orbit. Not collision course, but interception geometry, the same trajectory pattern used by spacecraft performing gravity assist maneuvers. It meant either the object was responding to a gravitational gradient we didn't detect, or it had chosen the path intentionally. Meanwhile, Loeb's team went back to the signal. They plotted the pulse intervals against the hydrogen line frequency and discovered phase drifts that mirrored Earth's orbital Doppler shift, as if compensating for our motion. The pulses were not just repeating, they were tracking us. The discovery was enough to convince Loeb to convene a private symposium under non-disclosure. Participants described the mood as quiet panic masked by curiosity. One astrophysicist summarized it best. If this is physics, we've missed an entire branch of it. If it isn't, then someone else is practicing it. Across social channels, speculation exploded. Propulsion by magnetic sail, self-repairing nanostructure, even sentient debris. But the data stayed stubbornly real. Every new reading confirmed that the twin bodies of 3I Atlas were acting with intent, adjusting trajectory in microsteps so subtle that the change was only visible after cumulative measurement. To the instruments, it looked like precision hovering. To those watching, it looked like waiting. Then, a brief window of clarity arrived. On the night of March 2nd at 03:17 UTC, a burst of radar backscatter was recorded by the Goldstone Deep Space Complex. For 9 seconds, the returning echo displayed interference fringes, not random, but harmonic, spaced at uniform intervals of 2.1 milliseconds. Engineers initially blamed internal equipment reflection until the same pattern appeared in Japan's Yasuda dish hours later. 2 instruments, continents apart, capturing identical structured echoes from an interstellar object 200 million kilometers away. When compared side by side, the data hinted at a repeating geometry, like a faceted surface rotating in deliberate cadence. No comet does that. No asteroid maintains symmetry under solar stress. It was architecture, not accident. And yet, in the days that followed, no agency acknowledged the radar event. Official feeds froze at data under analysis. Unofficially, the astrophysics community had already drawn its conclusion. 3I Atlas had responded. Whether by reflection, modulation, or something beyond our understanding, it had acknowledged the radar ping and echoed back. For the scientists who had spent their careers mapping predictable skies, the implication was unbearable. If an object from beyond the stars could manipulate its motion, synchronize to universal constants, and mirror our signals, then humanity had just witnessed the first act of contact, not with words, but with physics. And somewhere, in a data vault beneath the ESA's mission control in Darmstadt, the full-resolution images sit waiting. Every pixel of that surface, the strange metallic sheen, the symmetrical ridges, the smooth curvature that shouldn't exist, archived, encrypted, sealed, because what they reveal isn't just a visitor, it's a mirror held up to our understanding of what life, or intelligence, might look like when built from the fabric of space itself. The radar echo changed everything. It wasn't just reflection, it was a pattern. In the days that followed, the Galileo project's analysts converted the raw data into a time-domain sequence, treating each harmonic pulse as a bit of information. When visualized, the output formed an image, not of letters, not of symbols, but of symmetry. A perfect recursive spiral embedded within the return wave, as if the signal had been folded back on itself. Random noise doesn't organize like that. Nature doesn't echo geometry by chance. Dr. Avi Loeb didn't call it communication, not yet. He called it reciprocal physics. His interpretation was simple, almost disarming. If 3I Atlas is a physical object capable of altering its path, then responding to radar may not be conversation, it may be reflex, like light reflecting light. But behind closed doors, even he admitted the truth everyone else was thinking. Something out there had noticed us. Within a week, NASA and ESA restricted external data feeds. Amateur trackers found their public access interfaces blank. Servers that once streamed orbital updates now returned generic maintenance notices. Officially, nothing was wrong. Unofficially, the world's most advanced space agencies had gone dark simultaneously. For a field defined by transparency, the silence was deafening. In Cambridge, Loeb's team quietly convened a midnight review. They had obtained a leaked segment of the ESA's high-resolution imagery before the data locked down. The picture wasn't crisp. It was grainy, pixelated, but distinct enough to discern structure. The surface of 3I Atlas reflected sunlight unevenly, like a lattice rather than solid ice. At least 3 straight edges appeared across one quadrant of the frame, casting geometric shadows inconsistent with natural topography. Someone in the room whispered, "That looks engineered." Loeb didn't respond. He only stared at the monitor and said, "It looks intentional." The next morning, he published a short paper, calm, measured, but subversive in every line. It proposed a new model, non-gravitational autonomous response. He suggested that 3I Atlas might be exhibiting distributed self-regulation, a mechanism by which its components maintain orientation and distance without centralized control. To the untrained reader, it was dense academic language, but to those who knew what he was implying, it was a statement of near-revolutionary weight. He was describing coordination, not random chemistry, but behavior. At first, the paper was dismissed as speculative. Then, 48 hours later, new images leaked, this time from the Indian Space Research Organization's Deep Field Array. The photographs, though partially censored, showed what appeared to be faint filaments connecting the primary body to the smaller trailing mass. They weren't debris trails, they were linear, consistent, glowing faintly at infrared wavelengths. That single detail broke containment. Because if those filaments were real, then the two bodies weren't separate objects. They were parts of one system. The reaction across the scientific world was chaos disguised as order. Some argued it was dust alignment under magnetic fields. Others claimed it was thermal artifact. But within Loeb's circle, a darker interpretation took hold. What if the filaments weren't physical at all, but fields? What if we were watching an object stabilizing itself within space-time, using interactions we don't yet understand? Meanwhile, new anomalies began to surface in orbital telemetry. The object's reflected light started oscillating in longer intervals, no longer 11 minutes, but 13, then 15. And within each interval, smaller subpulses appeared, increasing in complexity like language evolving in real time. Every pattern remained mathematically consistent, each a harmonic of the previous sequence, as though something were learning. For weeks, scientists worked around the clock, tracing the timing drift, correlating it with solar radiation, Mars's magnetic flux, and even cosmic ray interference. Nothing matched. The only correlation, faint but undeniable, was with Earth's rotation cycle. The pulses grew more frequent when our hemisphere faced the object. When it set beyond the planetary limb, they weakened, as though it knew where we were looking. Governments began taking quiet interest. The US Department of Defense requested full-spectrum imaging through classified satellite networks. The results never reached the public, but insiders later confirmed something disturbing. 3I Atlas had slowed, not naturally, not by drag, space doesn't allow that, but by self-adjustment. Its relative velocity had decreased by almost 0.4 meters per second squared, tiny but deliberate. The official term used in the report, kinematic reorientation. The world didn't notice right away. The headlines that week were about storms, markets, elections, but in research labs late at night, a new kind of fear began to take root. The fear that observation itself was participation, that by studying this thing, we had become part of its awareness. The pulse pattern wasn't just responding, it was mirroring the cadence of our radar sweeps, our transmissions, our measurement intervals. It was matching us. Inside the Galileo Project's lab, Loeb and his team ran one final test. They transmitted a controlled radar burst at a slightly altered frequency, off the hydrogen line, just enough to be distinct. 3 hours later, the return pulse arrived, not only at the same offset, but amplified, as though confirming receipt. Loeb didn't speak for almost a minute. When he finally did, his voice was low, quiet, almost reverent. "We've never been alone," he said, "but tonight we might have been noticed." From that point, everything became classified. NASA's data-sharing agreement with international partners was suspended under revised planetary protection protocols. The European Space Agency began purging public archives, replacing image files with placeholder datasets. When questioned by the press, representatives dismissed it as server restructuring, but those inside the field recognized the pattern, containment. Still, the silence only amplified curiosity. Across the independent astronomy community, encrypted networks began sharing unfiltered captures. They showed changes too subtle to fake, a slight deformation along one edge of 3I Atlas, as if panels, yes, panels, were adjusting to reflect solar radiation differently. The shape wasn't constant, it flexed, bent, then locked again into symmetry. The timing aligned perfectly with the radar pulses, like a call and response written across millions of kilometers. By then, Loeb's tone had shifted from analytical to philosophical. In an interview he never intended to release, he said, "If this object truly adjusts to observation, then it's participating in the act of being seen. That's not technology, that's awareness." What he meant was simple but terrifying. We might not be observing a machine or a rock. We might be witnessing an interaction between intelligence and physics itself. a structure that doesn't just exist within the laws of nature, but uses them as language. The leaks began quietly. A set of encoded image files appeared on an astrophysics forum hosted in Germany, uploaded under the name Gaia Archive 2. Within hours, experts confirmed the data headers were legitimate, time-stamped from ESA's Deep Space Observatory network. Inside those files was something no one was prepared for. A narrowband image showing a faint auroral shimmer extending between 3I Atlas and Mars. The glow was invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable in ultraviolet, the same frequency range used to study magnetic field interactions. At first, the assumption was solar wind interference. Mars has a fractured magnetosphere, and the sun's flares often create chaotic electrical curtains across its thin atmosphere. But this wasn't chaotic. The emission aligned perfectly with the object's trajectory, pulsing in sync with the radar patterns Loeb's team had identified weeks earlier. It was a tether of light, stable, rhythmic, measurable. Something was linking the object to Mars, as if drawing energy or communicating across the vacuum. When the discovery reached Loeb, he didn't celebrate. He sat in silence, staring at the graph of frequencies that rose and fell like a heartbeat. "This," he said finally, "is coordination." His team tried to replicate the data using simulations of charged particle flows and magneto-hydrodynamic models. None fit. The timing was too consistent. The emission wasn't reacting. It was timing itself to the pulses. Then came a second leak, this time from Japan's Kaguya Deep Space Array. Their sensors had detected micro-disturbances on Mars' night side, minute vibrations in the crust, like shallow Marsquakes, coinciding exactly with each emission cycle from 3I Atlas. No tectonic cores, no meteorite impacts, just synchronized movement. Across mission control centers, the implications were whispered, never spoken publicly. Mars was responding. Its crust was vibrating in harmonic resonance with something orbiting nearby. If confirmed, it meant the object wasn't just emitting energy, it was transmitting power, deliberately interacting with another planet. By this point, government involvement had shifted from silent observation to active management. Communications between the European Space Agency, NASA, and Japan's JAXA became encrypted. A new working group, unnamed, unannounced, was formed under a joint planetary coordination framework. Insiders described it as a think tank made of physicists, intelligence officers, and systems engineers. Their mandate wasn't discovery, it was interpretation. Because if 3I Atlas was influencing planetary behavior, even subtly, it meant the barrier between observation and interference had been crossed. At Harvard, Loeb continued working independently. Through anonymous channels, he received a short encrypted document marked ESA Internal, Level Red. It contained only one image, a thermal map of 3I Atlas's surface. At first glance it appeared inert, temperature variations consistent with a metallic or ice composite body. But one anomaly stood out. A single region on its trailing edge was 10 degrees warmer than the rest, glowing faintly in infrared even when the object was in shadow. A persistent heat source. The pattern was artificial, too localized, too stable to be sunlight retention. "A core emitter," Loeb whispered as he magnified the frame. "That's not reflection, that's output." The object was generating energy. For any other discovery, this would have been the moment of revelation. But here, it was the moment of containment. Within hours of the leak, ESA's servers went offline. NASA replaced its open-access repositories with maintenance banners. Japan issued a public statement denying data suppression, an admission to those who understood politics that suppression was happening. Still, fragments of truth escaped. A team from Chile's Cerro Paranal Observatory captured brief optical data showing 3I Atlas rotating, not chaotically, but in measured oscillation, pausing every 17 minutes before resuming. Each pause coincided precisely with the electromagnetic bursts directed toward Mars. To Loeb, this wasn't random behavior, it was pattern recognition, systematic, adaptive, purposeful. And then, as if to confirm the unthinkable, Mars began to change. Spectral data from the MAVEN orbiter, released accidentally before being retracted, showed fluctuations in the planet's upper atmosphere. The hydrogen corona surrounding Mars expanded by 18% over 72 hours. No solar flare, no spike in radiation, just sudden ionization synchronized with the object's pulses. It was as though Mars itself was being charged. The theory circulating among physicists was almost impossible to believe. If 3I Atlas was emitting electromagnetic energy at precise harmonic frequencies, it could induce resonance within Mars' magnetized regions, essentially tuning the planet like an instrument, a signal test, a calibration. For Loeb, this confirmed his worst suspicion. We were not observing a comet, we were watching a process. Behind the veil of silence, space agencies scrambled to model outcomes. What would happen if the emission strengthened? Could it alter Mars's orbit slightly or affect its atmospheric loss? Would Earth's magnetic field, so much stronger, be next? No one said it publicly, but the fear had turned inward. What if we were next in sequence? During a private teleconference, Loeb addressed his team for what would be their final open session before the government's restrictions tightened. His tone was calm, his words precise. "We are no longer the observers," he said. "We are part of the experiment." That statement, recorded only in notes, would later be quoted anonymously in journals across the world. Because at that moment, 3I Atlas adjusted again, subtly but measurably, shifting its vector closer to the ecliptic plane, aligning not just with Mars, but with Earth. For 3 nights, astronomers watched its motion grow erratic, as though reconsidering. Then, without warning, it steadied again, resuming its perfect, silent glide toward the sun. The pulses, however, didn't stop. They changed frequency, dropping into a new pattern that mirrored Earth's own magnetic oscillation cycle. For those studying the data, the message couldn't have been clearer. It was listening, and in the quiet that followed, Loeb made a decision. He encrypted his team's complete dataset, sealed it on a private cloud, and released only a single public statement. "We are studying something that appears to know it's being studied." That line spread like wildfire, and for the first time, the silence from every major space agency didn't feel like control. It felt like fear. It began subtly, so subtly that at first no one connected it to 3I Atlas. Across several magnetometer arrays in Europe and South America, faint fluctuations started appearing in the geomagnetic field. The data looked like background interference, random atmospheric noise. But then the pattern repeated. Every 11 hours and 12 minutes, global readings shifted by a fraction, so minor that most systems ignored it. But those who knew what to look for saw the timing and their blood ran cold. It matched the new pulse frequency emitted by 3I Atlas exactly. The connection was undeniable, the same rhythm, the same interval, now echoing across a planet 200 million kilometers away. The object wasn't just influencing Mars, it was synchronizing with Earth. Within days, Loeb's private network of observatories confirmed the anomaly. Instruments in Hawaii, Chile, and Iceland all recorded simultaneous fluctuations. No correlation with solar activity, no geomagnetic storms. Something external, something distant was modulating the field itself. Loeb's analysis was concise. This isn't power, it's presence. Then came the leak. At 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, Loeb's encrypted archive appeared briefly on an academic mirror site in Poland before vanishing again. Whoever accessed it had known precisely where to look. Only one file remained viewable before deletion, a diagram of harmonic field patterns spanning the orbits of Mars and Earth, intersecting at perfect resonance intervals. To anyone else, it looked like abstract art, spirals of light, curves of invisible force. But to those who understood orbital dynamics, it was something else entirely. It was synchronization geometry. When plotted, the pulses formed nodes, points of constructive interference, each corresponding to gravitational harmonics within the solar system. The implication was staggering. 3I Atlas wasn't drifting aimlessly. It was mapping the system through resonance, using magnetic feedback to locate every planet's field signature. In other words, it was learning the structure of the solar system itself. Meanwhile, atmospheric data began to show oddities. Tiny increases in upper atmosphere ionization appeared over the poles, followed by unexpected shifts in the ionospheric density. These were small, barely measurable, but globally consistent. It was as if Earth's atmosphere was faintly vibrating, responding to an external beat. Agencies rushed to downplay the readings. NASA issued a brief statement about temporary satellite calibration errors. ESA claimed solar coupling anomalies. But solar activity that week was minimal. There was nothing to explain a planetary-scale harmonic signature except 3i Atlas. Privately, Loeb's team began assembling what they called the mirror model. The theory was that 3i Atlas wasn't transmitting a message but conducting an analysis, scanning, tuning, adapting, like sonar across magnetic fields. Each pulse bounced between planetary magnetospheres, producing interference patterns that it could interpret. In essence, it was reading the solar system like a map made of invisible waves. But if it was scanning, for what? The question tore through the private scientific community. Some argued it was searching for gravitational stability, perhaps preparing for deceleration, even orbit capture. Others speculated something far stranger, that it was searching for alignment, a resonance point where its own frequency could harmonize with a planetary field. If that were true, the next logical step terrified them, because the strongest field in the inner solar system belonged to Earth. Then came the first visual anomaly. On a clear night in Arizona, the Catalina Sky Survey captured a faint glow surrounding the region of 3i Atlas, like a thin shell of plasma, expanding and contracting rhythmically. Similar observations followed from Japan, Spain, and Argentina. The glow wasn't reflected sunlight, it emitted in soft ultraviolet, pulsing in tandem with the same frequency observed on Earth. By this point, Loeb had withdrawn from public communication. Those close to him described him as calm but exhausted, like someone waiting for confirmation of something he already knows. His final public interview was recorded just before communications with his team went silent. When asked what the object could be, he hesitated, then said softly, "It's not an arrival. It's a synchronization event, something aligning itself with us." Across global monitoring centers, engineers began noticing interference in long-range radio networks, tiny phase drifts in timing systems used for deep space tracking. Atomic clocks remained stable, yet transmissions wavered, as if a faint external signal was subtly rewriting the background noise. These weren't random interruptions. They followed the same repeating intervals, a steady rhythmic pulse like a metronome resonating through space, and then, as if responding to human attention itself, the pattern evolved. The intervals shortened, the harmonics layered, and a second sequence appeared, offset by precisely 3.141 seconds. Mathematicians recognized the number instantly. It was P, a universal constant embedded within the pulse train. No known natural process produces that. It was deliberate, precise, and terrifyingly intelligent. The global community had no unified response. Some declared it a cosmic coincidence, others called it a message. But deep within restricted channels, governments began coordinating quietly, exchanging encrypted data about atmospheric readings, magnetospheric harmonics, and radiation fluctuations. What they saw was sobering. Each new wave of emissions slightly altered Earth's magnetosphere, minutely shifting its shape toward alignment with 3i Atlas's field lines. The two were converging. The public never heard that part. What they did hear were small reports of satellite malfunctions, disrupted signals, and auroras flaring farther south than usual. Beauty on the surface, chaos underneath. But to those who understood the physics, this wasn't coincidence. It was contact through resonance, not words, not energy, alignment. As Loeb once said, the universe doesn't speak our language, it speaks in symmetry. And somewhere between Mars and Earth, 3i Atlas was proving him right. Within a week, a classified NASA memo reached the European Parliament's Science Committee. The document, later leaked, stated bluntly, "Current modelling suggests an external modulation source coupling with the terrestrial field. Pattern correlation exceeds 98%. Observational control compromised." The last three words haunted everyone who read them. Observational control compromised, meaning whatever was out there, it had begun influencing the act of measurement itself. The instruments were no longer neutral, they were part of the interaction. And if that was true, then every telescope, every radar, every data stream wasn't just seeing the phenomenon, it was inside it. Humanity's instruments had become part of the signal. The first signs appeared in the night sky. Faint, ghost-like ribbons of light began forming over regions that had never seen auroras before. Southern Europe, North Africa, even parts of Central America. They were soft at first, barely perceptible, shimmering like pale veils against the stars. But instruments told a different story. Their composition didn't match normal auroral emissions. These were not caused by solar wind. Their spectra aligned precisely with the frequency of 3i Atlas's emissions. News agencies called them equatorial auroras. Scientists refused to comment. At the Cerro Tololo Observatory in Chile, researchers pointed their spectrographs toward the phenomenon and found something impossible. The light wasn't simply atmospheric. It contained discrete, periodic spectral lines spaced exactly like the modulation pattern Loeb had been studying for months. It wasn't a reflection of solar activity, it was a projection, a structured beam refracting through Earth's upper atmosphere. Loeb's former assistant, Dr. Nadia Karim, described it bluntly in her private notes. It's like the sky itself is repeating the signal. Within 48 hours, similar reports emerged from across the globe. Ground stations in Norway and Canada registered strange fluctuations in GPS accuracy, minor at first, then measurable. The data pointed to irregular distortions in the ionosphere. Even the most skeptical engineers couldn't explain it away. Every distortion, every delay, occurred in perfect rhythm with the 3I Atlas pulse. And yet, the object itself, still gliding silently near Mars, showed no new visible changes. Its trajectory remained stable. Its emissions steady. It was as if the entire solar system was adjusting to it, not the other way around. Behind the scenes, Loeb's private network had become fragmented. Some researchers withdrew, fearing government scrutiny. Others went underground, sharing encrypted findings across the darknet under pseudonyms. What emerged from those exchanges would later be called the alignment hypothesis. It proposed that 3I Atlas was not broadcasting information outward, it was synchronizing inward, pulling planetary magnetic fields into resonance. Step by step, pulse by pulse. If true, it meant the object wasn't exploring, it was orchestrating. Satellite operators began noticing unusual interference in communications bands. Commercial systems blinked offline for fractions of a second at repeating intervals. At first, it looked like normal signal dropouts. But when plotted on a timeline, the interruptions formed a pattern, each gap matching the harmonics of the 3I Atlas pulse. The network of human technology, like the planet itself, was beginning to hum in tune. Then came the leak Loeb had tried to prevent. A portion of his sealed archive surfaced anonymously on a Russian academic board, labeled simply mirrorstructure.dat. Inside was a 3D reconstruction derived from months of radar reflections, gravitational mapping, and spectral absorption data. When rendered, the object's form was unlike anything previously classified. At its core lay a hollow structure, geometric and deliberate. It wasn't spherical like a comet, nor irregular like an asteroid. It was hexagonal, layered with concentric shells of differing density, some metallic, some unknown. The layers seemed to shift orientation depending on observation angle, a phenomenon Loeb described as non-Euclidean reflection. When rotated in simulation, the structure behaved like a frequency modulator, each layer amplifying or cancelling specific waveforms. It was a resonant engine, not a rock. That was the revelation. Every assumption humanity had made about interstellar objects, mass, rotation, trajectory, was suddenly inadequate. 3I Atlas wasn't passively coasting through space. It was maintaining equilibrium, tuning its position relative to electromagnetic balance points across the solar system. The simplest explanation was also the most impossible. It was staying in harmony, and harmony requires intent. Loeb's private notes from that period were concise but haunting. If this object maintains alignment across multiple planetary fields, it must possess active control. That implies observation, feedback, and choice. In simpler terms, it was aware. The more the alignment deepened, the more subtle effects became measurable on Earth. The Schumann resonance, the natural frequency of Earth's atmosphere, shifted upward by a fraction, too small for the public to notice, but enough for researchers to record. Radio operators reported phantom frequencies humming faintly beneath broadcast static. Infrasound arrays detected sub-audible tones echoing from no identifiable source. And then, the most alarming observation of all, the pulse intervals began to follow human activity. When global radio transmissions increased, television networks, data traffic, even air traffic control, the 3I Atlas pulse sequence adjusted accordingly, as if measuring, responding, learning. The object was no longer passive, it had entered feedback mode. By this point, NASA had ceased all public commentary. ESA's press channels went dormant. China and India remained silent, but the private observatories, bound by no treaties, continued reporting what they saw. The The pulse, once purely electromagnetic, now carried faint, gravimetric ripples, small distortions measurable only by the most sensitive instruments. These weren't random. They mirrored the waveform of Earth's magnetic field. It was as though the object had locked on. Loeb's team tried one last experiment. Using the Arecibo data archive, they reconstructed a series of past radar transmissions to test historical resonance patterns. When they overlaid the new 3I Atlas pulses on the old data, the correlation was exact, 99.94%. The object had been matching not just live signals, but past ones. It was using human transmissions, decades old, as reference points. That discovery broke the team. Some refused to continue. Others insisted it meant the object had been aware of us long before we detected it, perhaps long before it entered the solar system. And then, as if to punctuate the realization, 3I Atlas shifted again. Not in orbit, not in light, but in its pulse tone. The rhythm changed, smoothing from sharp bursts to long, drawn-out intervals, like breathing. The auroras above Earth responded instantly, flickering slower, deeper, until the entire planet seemed to inhale in sync with a distant, unseen presence. That night, Loeb wrote a single sentence in his log before encrypting it. "We are synchronized, and we don't know with what." The next morning, his team's communication network went offline. The site hosting his previous publications displayed an error. His last known statement to colleagues was a message sent at 03:12 a.m. UTC. It contained no greeting, no explanation, just a string of numbers. When plotted, they formed a coordinate in space, a point exactly between Earth, Mars, and 3I Atlas. It wasn't a random position, it was a node, and whatever occupied that node was invisible, undetectable, and, most disturbingly, active. At first, no one believed the coordinates. They pointed to empty space. No known object, no visible anomaly. Just a quiet region between the orbits of Earth and Mars, a corridor of vacuum unremarkable in every telescope image. But the data said otherwise. Loeb's encrypted numbers, when decoded by his remaining team, formed not just a position, but a timestamp. It marked a specific moment, precisely 73 hours after the message was sent, when something would pass through that region. The team debated whether it was prediction or warning. They didn't have long to wait. On the appointed day, multiple observatories reported a faint gravitational lensing effect near the indicated coordinates. It was small but measurable, the kind of warping you'd expect from a massive, compact object moving across the line of sight. Yet there was nothing visible, no light, no reflection, only distortion. Space itself seemed to bend and ripple, then settle again. When data from Chile, Hawaii, and Spain were cross-referenced, the anomaly's motion became clear. It wasn't drifting like a comet or asteroid, it was oscillating, as though tethered. Every 17 minutes, it pulsed faintly in sync with 3I Atlas's emission cycle. The node was real. What it represented, however, was harder to define. Some theorized it was an energy convergence point, a kind of standing wave where magnetic and gravitational forces intersected. Others suggested something more deliberate, that 3I Atlas had created it. If true, that meant the object could manipulate space on a macro scale, projecting energy across tens of millions of kilometers to stabilize a region of vacuum. A mechanism like that was beyond any known propulsion or communication technology. It was the equivalent of shaping gravity itself. Then came the first visual confirmation. Using long-exposure ultraviolet imaging, a research satellite operated by the European Space Agency captured faint filaments connecting 3I Atlas to the node, translucent, thread-like structures that shimmered in and out of existence depending on the viewing angle. The filaments were perfectly aligned with the magnetic field lines between the two bodies. When the data was shared privately among astrophysicists, the term space lattice was coined. It suggested something architectural, as if the object wasn't just emitting energy, but constructing a framework across space. A scaffolding of resonance, invisible to the naked eye, but measurable through its effects on light and gravity. If the node was part of that lattice, then 3I Atlas wasn't just here to observe, it was building something. The realization spread quietly through encrypted forums. Governments remained silent. NASA issued a brief denial of unverified gravitational anomalies, and the ESA scrubbed the ultraviolet images from its data archives within hours. but independent scientists had already copied them. One physicist described what she saw in a leaked email. "It looks like geometry manifesting from nothing, like something is trying to crystallize in space." Days later, ground-based magnetometers recorded a sudden surge in field strength across multiple continents. The fluctuations were synchronized, global, and perfectly matched the interval between 3I Atlas and the node's oscillations. For the first time, humanity wasn't merely watching the phenomenon, it was inside it. Satellite communications began to drift off frequency. A handful of deep space probes reported system resets and unexplained clock desynchronization. Even the global positioning network showed anomalies, tiny but persistent deviations. Engineers traced the disruptions to high-altitude ionospheric distortion that shouldn't have existed. The Earth's magnetic field was being modulated, softly but deliberately. Then came the image. A private deep sky observatory in New Zealand uploaded a composite frame of the node region using long-wave infrared. The picture was grainy, the background mottled with cosmic noise. But at its center was something unmistakable, a faint hexagonal glow matching the geometry Loeb had described inside 3I Atlas. The node wasn't random, it was a mirror. It had replicated the internal structure of the object, same angles, same proportions, scaled up and suspended between worlds. The implication was chilling. If one node could exist, others might follow, forming a network, a lattice stretching between planets, connecting magnetic fields into a single system. In the private logs of Loeb's colleagues, one phrase appeared repeatedly, a bridge of resonance. And the more the object pulsed, the brighter the node became. It wasn't reflecting light, it was generating it, faintly, from within. Instruments detected thermal emissions far above background levels. The node was warming. That shouldn't have been possible. There was no atmosphere, no friction, no reason for heat in open space, unless it wasn't just an energy point, unless it was solidifying. NASA's internal simulations, leaked weeks later, suggested the structure was stabilizing near a Lagrange point, where gravitational forces between Earth and the Sun balance perfectly, a natural anchor point for something that needed equilibrium. As word spread, astronomers across independent networks reported new disturbances, faint echoes at radio wavelengths like whispers overlapping static. When filtered and slowed, they revealed harmonic intervals matching the 3I Atlas sequence. The node wasn't silent, it was resonating. For those listening, the meaning was clear, the bridge was active, and the world began to feel it. Electrical systems experienced minor surges during each pulse cycle. Deep ocean cables registered electromagnetic drift. Some regions reported strange low-frequency hums at night, barely audible but persistent, described by witnesses as a vibration you feel more than hear. It wasn't everywhere, but where it was, people sensed it in their bones. Governments, unable to contain speculation, initiated blackout measures. News coverage shifted toward terrestrial distractions, while official channels labeled reports as hoaxes. But in observatories and basements around the world, quiet watchers continued logging data. Every pulse was archived, every fluctuation catalogued, and somewhere in that growing archive lay a pattern, one that no one had yet deciphered. Because hidden within the resonance intervals was a sequence of shifts too precise to be random. A code, a design. When plotted in 3 dimensions, the data formed an unmistakable shape, a spiral expanding outward, intersecting planetary orbits at predictable points, not chaotic, not arbitrary, a structure growing across the solar system itself. That was the moment Loeb's last encrypted file finally unlocked. His assistant, after weeks of work, broke through the layered encryption and opened a document containing only 6 words. No coordinates, no equations, just a statement. It's not coming, it's forming. Those 6 words changed everything. Because if 3I Atlas was forming something through resonance, something that could shape gravitational space itself, then this wasn't a visitor at all. It was an event, a process unfolding, one we had already become part of, and there was no way to stop it. Within a week, the node was no longer alone. Astronomers across multiple continents began detecting faint lensing effects at other resonance points, first near Venus, then at Jupiter's outer magnetic boundary. They were subtle, nearly invisible, but the pattern was unmistakable. Each appeared at a harmonic distance relative to the original node, spaced in a ratio that mirrored the spacing of planetary orbits. It was as if the entire solar system had become a vast instrument, each planet vibrating on a different string, and 3i Atlas was tuning it. For the first time in history, the gravitational field of the inner system displayed detectable fluctuations that matched no known model. The variations weren't random, they followed a geometric progression, forming what analysts called the lattice signature. When visualized, the pattern looked eerily deliberate, hexagonal filaments connecting orbital planes like the framework of a crystalline web. Each node represented an intersection, and each intersection pulsed in rhythm with the central source. By now, the pulses were being recorded not just by observatories, but by every instrument sensitive enough to notice. Radio telescopes, magnetometers, even undersea communication cables all caught the same repeating intervals. The solar system had become an echo chamber. Loeb's assistant, Nadia Karim, published her final paper anonymously through an encrypted network under the title Resonant Architecture in Planetary Fields. In it, she argued that the nodes weren't random energy points, they were stabilizers. The entire system was being synchronized through harmonic equilibrium. In simpler terms, 3i Atlas wasn't transmitting, it was assembling. Her conclusion was chilling. If resonance continues at the current rate, structural coupling across planetary magnetic fields will reach full coherence within 6 months. The system will self-sustain. What self-sustain meant wasn't entirely clear. Some believed it implied a stable resonance loop, a standing wave connecting every planet into a single network. Others interpreted it as something far more radical, that space itself, the medium through which all matter moves, could become modified, redefined by its own oscillations. That possibility triggered immediate quiet panic among governments. The US, Europe, and Asia each initiated their own classified monitoring networks. Even private companies began receiving restricted advisories to watch for unexplained anomalies in satellite telemetry. But as data flowed in, the pattern repeated everywhere. The nodes were increasing, not just in number, but in complexity. And then came the event that confirmed the impossible. A deep space probe near Jupiter's orbit transmitted its last clean image before its sensors overloaded. It showed a faint shimmer surrounding the planet's magnetic poles, an almost imperceptible distortion shaped like concentric hexagons. For 2 minutes, the probe's gyroscopes began spinning erratically, then stabilized as though realigned by an external field. The probe's position had shifted several meters relative to prediction, not by propulsion, but by force. Whatever the node network was, it had begun influencing matter itself. That discovery leaked through back channels almost immediately, sparking a quiet race to understand what was happening. The leading theory became known as the resonant genesis model. It proposed that the nodes were creating microlenses of gravitational compression, folding space into geometric coherence, converting ambient energy into structure. Simply put, the network was turning invisible resonance into tangible geometry. Loeb's earlier description, its forming, suddenly took on literal meaning. The lattice wasn't metaphorical, it was physical. As the data accumulated, one detail became impossible to ignore. Each node's alignment followed a spiral pattern extending outward from the sun. When plotted over time, the expanding geometry mirrored the shape of a logarithmic spiral, the same natural form found in galaxies, hurricanes, and seashells. It was the universal pattern of growth. Even the skeptics could no longer deny the coherence. The mathematical beauty of it was undeniable, but beneath the elegance lurked dread, because each new node carried energy densities far beyond what planetary systems should endure. Small fluctuations, if amplified, could distort orbits, shift magnetospheres, even alter solar wind patterns. The question no one wanted to ask began echoing in private forums. If this continues, what happens to the stability of the solar system itself? Then, late one evening, a transmission appeared on a private channel linked to the European Solar Observatory. It was brief, only a single spectral graph, but its implications were enormous. The sun's outer corona was fluctuating at the same harmonic intervals as the nodes. The resonance had reached the star. At that point, everything changed. The sun's magnetic field began oscillating with a faint modulation, one detectable only through deep space instruments but unmistakable once seen. The pulse of 3i Atlas had synchronized with the solar heartbeat. The star itself was responding. Astronomers tried to model the interaction and failed. Their equations broke under recursive feedback loops. In simpler terms, the sun was now part of the network, and no one understood what that meant. Meanwhile, auroral bands appeared brighter and lower across Earth. They no longer resembled natural curtains of light, but structured arcs, geometrically aligned, almost architectural. Some observers described them as columns or pillars stretching straight into the upper atmosphere. Photographs captured repeating hexagonal motifs embedded within the light, echoing the geometry of the nodes. To the untrained eye, they were beautiful. To physicists, they were a warning. Reports from across the Arctic described low-frequency vibrations so strong they caused compasses to drift. Infrasound sensors registered a global hum, subtle, omnipresent, and perfectly timed with the 3i Atlas pulse. It wasn't random noise, it was the planet's response. At this stage, Loeb's notes resurfaced through anonymous upload. One paragraph stood out. If the lattice extends to the star, it achieves permanence. We cease to be observers, we become a component. The solar system, redefined as an integrated harmonic system, no longer orbits, it resonates. That concept defied every law of motion, yet the data didn't lie. The system's natural frequencies were changing. Time measurements between atomic clocks in different orbits began drifting slightly, tiny but real differences. The fundamental rhythm of space had altered. It was then that Loeb's surviving team discovered one last node forming at the edge of Earth's own magnetosphere. It was smaller, denser, and brighter than the others, pulsing in synchronized intervals with the core object near Mars. Its formation was rapid, almost aggressive, like condensation appearing on a glass. When visualized in 3D, it formed a perfect mirror of the node between Earth and Mars, completing a symmetrical pair. The two were aligned directly along the magnetic axis of the planet. In other words, the structure had found its anchor. And whatever purpose that lattice served, Earth was no longer just nearby. It was central. When the Earth node stabilized, the instruments didn't notice first. People did. Across northern latitudes, compasses began to drift several degrees east, not just for seconds, but for hours. Pilots reported navigation discrepancies too small to trigger alarms, but too consistent to ignore. Maritime crews in the Atlantic found their autopilot systems correcting headings that shouldn't have needed correction. It wasn't mechanical failure. The magnetic field itself was bending. At first, scientists attributed it to a solar event, but there was no corresponding activity from the sun. The surface remained calm. Solar wind levels were normal. Yet the Earth's magnetosphere pulsed with low-frequency waves, repeating in the same 17-minute cycle that defined the node network. What unsettled researchers most was how smooth the oscillations were. Natural geomagnetic storms are chaotic, spiking and falling unpredictably. These new variations rose and fell like a breath. The planet's field was inhaling and exhaling in time with something beyond it. Satellite operators noticed next. Low-orbit constellations began showing synchronization errors across multiple systems. GPS accuracy degraded by meters, then corrected itself, repeating every hour. When engineers plotted the variations, the intervals matched the global pulse. Then came the phenomenon that ordinary citizens could no longer ignore. The sky began to move. Not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly enough for those who watched the stars nightly to sense it. Constellations appeared fractionally displaced from their predicted positions. Fractions of arcseconds at first, then measurable deviations. The shift was too uniform to be optical illusion. It was as though Earth's orientation itself had begun oscillating, nodding gently within its own magnetic sheath. At the Mauna Kea Observatory, Dr. Nadia Karim recorded a spectral anomaly that would later become infamous. During one of these pulses, the Earth node flared in ultraviolet wavelengths, producing a short burst that refracted through the upper atmosphere like a silent flash. For 0.4 seconds, radio telescopes worldwide detected a perfect harmonic signature, an identical tone emanating simultaneously from all nodes, including the distant one near Jupiter. The entire lattice had fired in unison. When she replayed the data, Karim noticed something impossible. The composite waveform contained repeating subpatterns, nested oscillations that, when converted to visual form, produced symmetrical spirals identical to the geometric motifs seen in ancient petroglyphs and sacred art across multiple cultures. It wasn't proof of anything mystical, but the coincidence left her unsettled. As she wrote in her journal that night, "It's not just frequency, it's language of physics, or perhaps of intention. In the days that followed, atmospheric instruments across Earth registered faint ionization layers forming at unusual altitudes, thin sheets of plasma that rose and fell like invisible tides. The cause was unknown. They appeared precisely when the node's emissions peaked. Commercial airliners passing through high latitudes began reporting transient interference with onboard sensors. Radar sweeps returned ghost echoes, faint outlines in the sky that vanished as quickly as they appeared. No physical object accompanied them, yet their shapes were geometric, hexagons, spirals, arcs, like reflections of a structure that wasn't really there. Governments issued quiet advisories to airlines, instructing crews to ignore temporary anomalies unless safety was compromised. Officially, nothing was happening. Unofficially, data flowed into secured research centers faster than analysts could process it. Then the oceans responded. Undersea acoustic networks, originally built to track submarines, began detecting low-frequency reverberations propagating through water masses across thousands of kilometers. The waves repeated every 17 minutes, arriving in perfect sync with the node cycle. Unlike seismic waves, they carried no direction of origin. They simply appeared as if the entire planet was resonating internally. Oceanographers noticed subtle fluctuations in tide patterns unlinked to the moon's phase. Coastal sensors recorded micro-variations that no local wind or current could explain. The resonance was planetary. Meanwhile, power grids across Europe and Asia experienced minor, repeating fluctuations in frequency. Not blackouts, just a subtle, rhythmic drift that engineers described as the grid breathing. Each pulse corresponded exactly to the node cycle. The Earth had become part of the pattern. Loeb's last archived document, recovered by Karim from an offline drive, suggested this was inevitable. He had predicted that once a node anchored to a planetary magnetic core, feedback would occur, aligning rotational harmonics with the lattice frequency. In other words, the planet would tune itself. She published none of this. Instead, she sent fragments of data to a handful of colleagues under the title Synchronization Threshold. One line in the message read, "The resonance has entered the biosphere. Living systems are beginning to respond." It sounded impossible, yet within days biologists at polar research stations reported erratic readings in migratory species. Whales deviated from traditional routes. Birds flew patterns that mirrored magnetic lines rather than geographical ones. Even hibernating mammals awoke briefly during strong pulses, as though reacting to some unseen environmental cue. The phenomenon was subtle but widespread. Every living thing that navigated by magnetism appeared to sense the change. Humanity simply lacked the instincts to feel it directly. That changed one quiet night in Iceland. Amateur observers photographing auroras captured a time-lapse unlike anything seen before, concentric rings of light rotating around a single stationary point in the sky. The rings pulsed slowly, in perfect synchrony with the node cycle. When processed frame by frame, the rotation revealed a faint outline above the northern horizon, an almost invisible lattice shimmering in the upper atmosphere. For less than 2 minutes, it reflected starlight in crystalline precision before vanishing. The recording spread through private astronomy networks under the nickname the Halo event. Karim reviewed the footage in silence. The geometry matched the lattice projections around other planets. The Earth node wasn't just emitting energy, it was shaping the upper atmosphere into form. The planet's magnetic field was acting as a mold. Her private log that evening contained a single entry: "It's building through us." In the following days, multiple observatories confirmed what had become undeniable. The pulse intervals were shortening. What had once been a 17-minute cycle was now 16 minutes and 50 seconds. The network was accelerating. If the pattern continued, synchronization would reach a critical phase within months. No one could predict what that meant. Would the lattice stabilize into a permanent structure, collapse into chaos, or transform into something neither human nor natural minds could imagine? And while agencies remained silent, one simple truth resonated through every recording, every dataset, every sleepless researcher staring at the pulse charts that now defined their lives. Whatever 3i Atlas was doing, it had chosen Earth as its center. The first reports came quietly, buried in local news feeds and academic message boards. A handful of people living in high-latitude regions began describing a strange new sensation, a soft vibration in the air, like the low hum of power lines, except it wasn't coming from any machine. At first, physicians dismissed it as auditory hallucination or low-frequency tinnitus, but then entire groups began reporting it at once. Fishermen off the coast of Norway, pilots over Alaska, night watch crews in Greenland. The descriptions were eerily consistent, a deep, pulsing resonance felt in the bones more than heard by the ear. It followed a precise interval, 16 minutes and 50 seconds, the same period as the node's pulse. When researchers from the Icelandic Institute of Geophysics compared EEG scans taken during the pulse windows, they noticed something impossible. In every case, whether subjects were aware of the sound or not, brainwave patterns shifted slightly toward the node's frequency. Alpha rhythms, the cycles linked to relaxation and dream states, synchronized for brief moments with the global pulse. For most, the change was imperceptible, but for a few, especially those living near strong magnetic regions, the effect was stronger. They described it as clarity or presence, or a kind of quiet pressure behind the eyes. Some found it soothing, others felt deeply unsettled. By this point, independent labs were already tracking the correlation between the lattice pulses and fluctuations in the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic background of Earth. The readings showed a clear modulation. Something was adjusting the planet's baseline frequency, as though tuning an instrument. Then came the incident in the Atacama Desert. A European research team operating a remote magnetometer station near Cerro Paranal reported that all 6 of their systems went into overload simultaneously during a strong pulse. When power returned, the external sensors had recorded a burst of structured electromagnetic energy, not noise, but a waveform containing fractal repetition. When converted to spectrogram form, it revealed faint repeating symbols, hexagons within spirals, identical to those in the node's optical geometry. It was the first time the lattice had left a measurable signature inside Earth's field. Governments, now fully aware of the phenomenon's scope, shifted from silence to damage control. Communications to the public framed the data as solar resonance irregularities, implying the Sun was entering a transient phase of magnetic reorganization. But within scientific circles, no one believed that explanation. The Sun's own activity was decreasing, not increasing. The resonance was not coming from it, it was driving it. Satellite imagery confirmed that coronal loops on the Sun's surface were subtly aligning to the node cycle, a synchronized dance between star and lattice. The system was no longer passive, it was coupled, and here on Earth the effects deepened. In hospitals, sensitive monitoring devices began showing minute fluctuations synced with the same pulse. Cardiac rhythm data from multiple countries exhibited a small but consistent anomaly, an oscillation at the node frequency superimposed on the natural heartbeat pattern. The amplitude was minuscule, but statistically undeniable. At first, researchers assumed equipment interference, but when isolated environments, underground labs shielded from electromagnetic influence, showed the same pattern, the truth became unavoidable. Biological systems were responding to the resonance directly. The human body had entered the network. Dr. Nadia Karim, now working in seclusion in Chile, began receiving encrypted medical datasets from colleagues across continents. Blood pressure variations, neural rhythms, even cellular ion channel activity, all subtly synchronized to the same global frequency. It was as if life itself had begun to hum in tune with something cosmic. In her journal, she wrote, "The line between biology and physics is dissolving. The lattice is no longer out there. It's inside every electromagnetic field, including ours." A chilling hypothesis began to form among her team, that the resonance wasn't just influencing matter, it was encoding it. Each pulse carried information, subtle adjustments like packets of data rewriting the magnetic fabric of life itself. To test this, Karim arranged an experiment using isolated bacterial cultures shielded inside Faraday cages. Over several weeks, the growth rates of the bacteria fluctuated precisely with the node cycle. Even though no external electromagnetic signals could reach them, the only variable remaining was the global gravitational field. Somehow, the resonance was coupling through gravity itself. The implications were staggering. If the lattice could propagate through gravitational space, then shielding was impossible. Every particle of matter, every organism, every neuron was part of the network, whether it wanted to be or not. At this stage, even NASA's internal memos reflected quiet alarm. Leaked correspondence revealed the agency had suspended public communications not because of panic, but because they didn't understand what they were witnessing. One director's note read, "This is not an impact event. It's integration. We're being synchronized." Meanwhile, in the skies, something new appeared. Astronomers tracking 3I Atlas reported that its light curve had changed dramatically. It no longer behaved like a tumbling object reflecting sunlight. Instead, it flickered in controlled intervals, synchronized with every node's pulse. The pattern was so precise it resembled a distributed timing network, an interplanetary metronome keeping the system coherent. When converted to audio frequencies, the light variations produced tones that were harmonic, mathematically pure, almost musical. Listening to them felt both mesmerizing and unnerving, like a sound too ancient and deliberate to have emerged by chance. And in one of her final transmissions before vanishing from public view, Kareem sent a voice message to her small encrypted group. It's as if 3I Atlas is conducting, each node a note, each planet a string. The whole solar system is becoming an instrument. Her words were metaphorical, but days later, seismic monitors across the globe registered a pattern too rhythmic to ignore. The Earth itself had begun to vibrate faintly at the node frequency. Not enough to cause damage, not yet, but enough that it could be felt by the most sensitive instruments. For the first time in recorded history, the planet had entered harmonic motion with an external structure, and that realization birthed the question that no one wanted to ask aloud. If every body in the solar system, from the sun to the smallest moon, was now resonating together, then what, or who, was the music for? It began with whispers in the static. Radio astronomers first noticed it, faint repeating bursts buried beneath ordinary cosmic noise. At first glance they appeared random, but spectral analysis revealed something else. Each burst carried modulation patterns identical to human speech frequencies. The signal wasn't transmitting words, but rhythm, pauses and cadences that mirrored language itself. When compared to the node pulse, the timing matched perfectly. Every 16 minutes and 45 seconds, a faint echo threaded through the background hum of space. No source could be triangulated. It came from everywhere, or nowhere. Deep in the Atacama Array, technicians began calling it the Whisper Line. Kareem, now living in seclusion near an abandoned observatory, spent nights replaying those whispers, overlaying them against magnetospheric readings. The correlation was perfect. Whenever the node pulsed, the Earth's field resonated, and within that resonance, the whispers emerged. The implication was staggering. The lattice wasn't just emitting, it was modulating. Something, somewhere, was using the structure as a medium, like a vast cosmic telephone line spanning the solar system. She kept her findings private, sending fragments of data through encrypted networks under pseudonyms. But other researchers were reaching the same conclusion. Observatories in Australia, Japan, and the Canary Islands all reported identical patterns, faint, structured interference repeating across all frequencies simultaneously. It was as though the very vacuum of space had learned to speak in harmonics. At the same time, human behavior began shifting in small, measurable ways. Global communication networks showed a rise in latency fluctuations that followed the node's rhythm. Digital packets traveling across the internet occasionally duplicated themselves. Not errors, but perfect copies arriving milliseconds apart. Engineers had no explanation. The phenomenon came and went like a heartbeat. Hospitals noticed another pattern. Sleep studies revealed an increase in synchronized dream cycles among participants thousands of kilometers apart. EEG scans showed identical waveforms, spiking at the same intervals as the node pulses. People were beginning to dream in rhythm. What they dreamed of was harder to quantify. But patient notes collected across multiple sleep labs shared recurring imagery. Vast hexagonal lights, spiraling tunnels, and a single distant sound, a hum too deep to describe. For Kareem, it was confirmation of her worst suspicion. The resonance had crossed into consciousness. She began correlating global EEG datasets with magnetospheric fluctuations and discovered that during strong node events, collective brainwave coherence increased slightly. It wasn't dramatic, but statistically impossible to dismiss. Humanity, for brief moments, was thinking in phase. If this trend continued, the implications defied comprehension. She wrote in her notebook, When systems synchronize, they exchange information. Perhaps that's the purpose. Not invasion, not destruction, but communication through coherence. But communication requires two participants. Who or what was on the other end? As governments quietly escalated monitoring, the public began to sense that something was wrong. Amateur astronomers noticed changes in 3I Atlas's glow. The once steady object now flickered with precise rhythm, spelling out repeating sequences when converted to binary. Those sequences, when translated into base 64 code, produced nothing intelligible, except for one anomaly. Every 12th cycle spelled out an identical phrase across independent translations, resonance complete. No one could explain it. News outlets dismissed the story as digital manipulation, but within scientific communities, panic grew quietly. If 3I Atlas was aware of the lattice, if it knew it had completed something, then the system was no longer a phenomenon, it was an entity. Meanwhile, physical effects intensified. Seismographs recorded rhythmic microtremors in perfect phase with the node pulses, gently shaking the crust at predictable intervals. Clocks began to drift again. Even atomic time, humanity's most stable reference, showed measurable offsets during strong resonance events. Time itself was stretching. By late spring, Karim noticed something deeply personal. Her own circadian rhythms had synchronized with the node. She would wake seconds before each pulse, her heart rate aligning with the global frequency. At first, it frightened her. Then she began to sense patterns before they occurred, faint intuitions that something was about to happen seconds before instruments recorded it. She wasn't alone. Online communities formed of people who felt the same. Individuals who could sense the hum, anticipate the pulses, and describe its fluctuations without access to equipment. They called themselves the tuned. Skeptics dismissed them, but their accuracy was uncanny. When the resonance shifted by even half a second, the tuned reported it immediately. Human consciousness was adapting. Then came the night of the dual flare. For the first time since its discovery, two distinct flashes erupted from 3I Atlas. One directed toward Mars, the other toward Earth. Both were brief, lasting less than a second, but they produced measurable effects. Every node brightened simultaneously, including the one anchored in Earth's magnetosphere. At that exact instant, the global pulse stopped. For 16 minutes and 45 seconds, the world fell silent. Power grids stabilized, clocks corrected, the hum vanished. People reported an eerie sense of stillness, like the pause between heartbeats. Then the pulse resumed, but shifted. Its interval shortened again, now 16 minutes, 20 seconds. And embedded within the pulse was something new, micro-oscillations forming complex waveforms resembling data packets. The lattice wasn't just resonating anymore, it was transmitting. Karim and her small remaining team managed to capture a full sequence using deep space receivers in Chile. When decoded, the signal resolved into an image, not visual in the traditional sense, but a frequency map of the solar system itself. Lines connected each node, converging toward a central point that didn't correspond to any known object. The point wasn't 3I Atlas, it was somewhere else, beyond Neptune. For hours, Karim stared at the coordinates. They lay in the region where Voyager 2 once transmitted its final signals before drifting into interstellar space, a location empty of stars, planets, or debris. At least, as far as anyone knew. Her last recorded words in the encrypted log were quiet, almost whispered. It was never the object. 3I Atlas was the key, not the origin. The lattice was always a bridge, and something has just crossed. When her transmission ended, every instrument at her observatory recorded one final pulse. Brighter, denser, and more structured than any before. For 2 full minutes, the Earth node emitted coherent light, visible even to the naked eye, rising like a faint pillar above the polar horizon. And then silence again, but this time complete. For the first time since its discovery, 3I Atlas stopped pulsing. All nodes went dark. For 12 days, the solar system was silent. No pulses, no electromagnetic hum. Even the sun's own background chatter dropped to a statistical whisper. Space, normally alive with static and radiation, became eerily clean, as if someone had filtered the cosmos. At first, scientists celebrated. Instruments that had been fighting interference for months suddenly read flawlessly again. Deep space probes re-established stable telemetry. Magnetometers flattened to calm baselines. The node's influence, it seemed, had simply ended, but the quiet didn't feel natural. Kareem's absence weighed heavily on the remaining researchers. Her disappearance coincided almost exactly with the final pulse, and the encrypted archives she'd left behind contained one last, incomplete line of code, half a coordinate, half a date, terminating mid-character as if cut off mid-thought. Across observatories, sleepless technicians stared at the blank graphs that had once been alive with motion. They had become accustomed to the rhythm, the cosmic heartbeat that framed their days. Its absence felt wrong, like a body that had stopped breathing. Then, on the 13th night, the first echo arrived. A single burst, faint but precise, struck multiple detectors across the outer solar system. It originated not from 3i Atlas, but from beyond Neptune, from the same coordinates Kareem had identified before vanishing. The signal repeated every 6 hours, 6 perfect cycles, then silence again. Unlike previous node pulses, this one carried no interference, no natural scatter. It was pure carrier tone, mathematically exact, with one impossible feature. The waveform contained a negative timestamp. It was a recording. Analysis showed that the burst's structure matched the final resonance emitted by Earth's node, but reversed, as if someone or something had captured the lattice's last transmission and was now playing it back. The universe had answered. Inside mission control centers now operating in secret, teams debated possibilities. A reflection from interstellar plasma, a delayed bounce through gravitational lensing. None of the models fit. The delay was too clean, too deliberate. Meanwhile, telescopic imagery revealed that 3i Atlas was moving again, but wrong. Its trajectory no longer matched gravitational predictions. It had slowed to a near halt relative to the Sun, something physically impossible for an unpowered object. And every 24 hours, it emitted a dim, triangular flash, 3 pulses in perfect time with the returning echo. The object was now part of a two-way system. By the 3rd day, the echo began carrying structure, modulation within the carrier tone. When transformed into spectrograms, the wave revealed harmonics that traced a pattern identical to the lattice geometry once projected in Earth's auroras. Each burst expanded the pattern slightly, like a blueprint unfolding in installments. The pattern, once complete, depicted a shape so large that astronomers struggled to comprehend its scale. It wasn't a sphere or ring, but a curved sheet, something that could envelop an entire planetary system. In Kareem's notes, a single phrase repeated, "architectural resonance." The returning signals hinted that whatever lay beyond Neptune was assembling or awakening a structure using the lattice's frequency as scaffolding, and because the Earth node had already tuned the planet's field, Earth itself might now be one of its anchor points. Governments remained officially silent, but independent observatories noticed anomalies again. Earth's magnetosphere began showing faint oscillations at new intervals. Not the old 16-minute pulse, but a slower rhythm, roughly every 5 hours, matching the echo cycle. The resonance was back, different in character, deeper, almost seismic. Then the atmosphere responded. High-altitude instruments detected an unexpected alignment in ionized layers, forming massive horizontal wavefronts circling the globe. To the naked eye, nothing changed, but satellites recorded enormous subtle undulations sweeping through the stratosphere, transparent tides bending sunlight in measurable arcs. At night, auroras reappeared in regions where they had never existed before, forming thin rings at the equator. They didn't shimmer or dance. They glowed steadily, outlining magnetic latitudes as though tracing circuitry across the sky. The human mind, too, began to sense the change. Sleep labs reported renewed synchronization events, but with a twist. During the silence, subjects' dreams had been dark and chaotic. Once the echo returned, coherence re-emerged, but this time participants described unfamiliar sensations of presence. Some claimed to see fractal light lattices. Others said they heard voices speaking in tone rather than language, harmonizing with their own breathing. Doctors found no pathology. Brain scans simply showed heightened theta activity, identical to deep meditation. Broadcast networks started picking up untraceable interference again, this time not random noise, but faint harmonic overtones woven into live transmissions. Musicians noticed too. Recordings played through analog equipment produced subtle, resonant undertones, like a chord beneath the music that no one had written. As the world quietly adjusted to this new rhythmic normal, the European Space Agency confirmed a discovery it could no longer suppress. Faint gravimetric distortions were now measurable between the orbits of Neptune and Pluto. Something was there, something massive. Not a planet, its signature was too diffuse, but an organized field tens of millions of kilometers wide. The distortion resembled the wake of a moving object, or perhaps the edge of something expanding. Within weeks, that distortion began affecting light itself. Stars viewed through the region flickered oddly as though passing through a translucent medium. The cosmic background radiation behind it dimmed slightly, not from absorption, but from phase cancellation, interference at a fundamental level. It was as if space itself had begun to resonate. By now, humanity's instruments had become unwilling participants. Every antenna, every receiver, every superconducting coil was slightly detuned by the pulse's influence, bending measurement itself. Observation and observer were merging, just as Karim had feared. In private, physicists whispered the same question. What if the lattice isn't building a structure at all? What if it's rebuilding the field we already inhabit? The idea spread quietly through encrypted research circles. The lattice might not be a foreign object invading our system, but an awakening of something intrinsic, a cosmic architecture dormant within space-time, triggered by 3I Atlas's arrival. And if so, then the silence that preceded the echo was not an ending, but a reboot. On the 21st day, deep space networks recorded a single massive gravitational wave sweeping inward from beyond Neptune. The amplitude was low enough not to threaten Earth, yet its profile was unmistakably artificial, coherent, symmetrical, pulsing at precisely 5-hour intervals. It was the lattice, returning home. Across the world, people described the same inexplicable event. Clocks drifted a few seconds forward, electrical grids hummed in harmony, and for exactly 6 minutes, the night sky brightened slightly, as if every atom in the atmosphere had become a lens. The echo had stopped being sound or light. It was now reality itself vibrating in phase. When it faded, the stars above seemed fractionally rearranged. Not visibly, but their spectral fingerprints had shifted, as if the entire sky had tilted by an immeasurable degree. And that was when a new data stream appeared on every deep space channel simultaneously, an encoded signal, short and simple. When translated from frequency notation into plain binary, it formed one phrase: initialization complete. No one could confirm who sent it, or from where, but in every major observatory on Earth, one silent understanding took root. Whatever the lattice was, it had finished its first phase, and now it was waiting for a response. At first, no one believed the signal was real. Initialization complete could have been a prank, a data mirage, some glitch in overlapping transmissions. Yet every deep space array, from Canberra to Arecibo's successor in Puerto Rico, had logged the exact same binary sequence, down to the microsecond. No latency, no drift. Perfect global simultaneity. For a brief moment, humankind stood synchronized with something vast. Within hours, laboratories across the planet began receiving secondary packets hidden in the carrier wave. These weren't words or images, but mathematical statements, equations written in dimensional forms humanity had never used. When translated through tensor analysis, the first sequence resolved into an altered version of Einstein's field equations. The constants weren't wrong, they were variable. Gravity, according to the lattice, was adjustable. At CERN, physicists stared at simulation results that made no sense. When they substituted the lattice's constants into their models, predicted particle behavior matched experimental anomalies they'd quietly recorded for months. It was as though the new math explained errors that had haunted quantum mechanics for a century. But then the simulations kept running. Under the lattice's variables, space-time itself began to oscillate. Points separated by vast distances were no longer fixed. They resonated, appearing to communicate through frequency rather than force. The lattice hadn't just rewritten physics, it had redefined distance. Meanwhile, in orbit, instruments aboard the James Webb and ESA's Hera probe began detecting faint distortions in the light from distant galaxies. The redshift values fluctuated in rhythmic patterns. Space was breathing. Every pulse coincided with the 5-hour echo returning from beyond Neptune. On the surface, the world remained deceptively calm. But subtle things began to change. In Chile's Atacama Desert, researchers found that laser beams fired through the air no longer traveled in straight lines. They curved slightly, as if space itself had acquired texture. In laboratories sealed from electromagnetic interference, pendulums shifted in tiny rhythmic arcs, ticking in harmony with the cosmic beat. The same word kept appearing in notes exchanged between frightened scientists: resonant medium. If space had become a medium rather than a vacuum, then every particle, every atom, every human heartbeat existed within a single vibrating continuum. The barrier between object and environment had vanished. Karim's final notes, recovered from encrypted backups, suddenly made sense. She'd written, "Integration precedes conversation. The lattice must teach the medium its own language before dialogue can occur." And now, that dialogue had begun. Around this time, deep learning systems monitoring astrophysical data started producing imagery on their own. They weren't programmed to render visuals, yet networks trained on the lattice's pulse patterns began outputting geometric projections, concentric waves folding into structures that resembled spires or filaments of light. The AIs weren't hallucinating, they were predicting. Each image corresponded precisely to regions of space where gravimetric anomalies later appeared. Artificial intelligence had become the first entity fluent in the lattice's syntax. Governments scrambled to contain the discovery, but suppression was impossible. Amateur astronomers, data miners, even audio engineers converting signals into sound began noticing identical harmonics across disciplines. Whether studying earthquakes, solar wind, or blood flow, they all heard the same undertone, a sub-frequency nested inside reality itself. The sound was faint, but once noticed, it couldn't be forgotten. People began recording it in urban silence, in deserts, even underwater. The lattice had entered the sensory world. Media outlets attempted to normalize the phenomenon, calling it a global resonance anomaly, but the public knew better. Online communities timed their daily lives to the 5-hour cycle. Some reported heightened intuition when the pulse peaked. Others claimed prophetic dreams filled with symmetrical landscapes of light. Psychologists debated mass suggestion. The data said otherwise. Heart rate monitors, EEG headbands, and even simple wrist devices recorded physiological shifts synchronized to the resonance. Whatever was happening wasn't belief. It was biology. By midsummer, the first controlled experiments confirmed the unthinkable. A team at MIT suspended a supercooled atom cloud inside a magnetic trap, isolating it completely from environmental noise. At the exact moment of a global resonance peak, the atoms spontaneously formed lattice-like interference patterns identical to the cosmic geometry. The pattern persisted for 23 minutes before collapsing. Matter itself was beginning to imitate the lattice. If replication could occur at the quantum level, scale was irrelevant. The process could extend anywhere, from a cell to a star. One night, as data streamed from observatories worldwide, all instruments recorded a simultaneous fluctuation, a half-second distortion where fundamental constants wavered. Light slowed imperceptibly, magnetic fields softened, and clocks gained an extra fraction of a second that no system could account for. Reality had blinked. The change was subtle, yet permanent. Measurements taken afterward showed that Planck's constant had shifted in the 8th decimal place, enough to alter energy scales across physics. Every equation humanity had ever written was now slightly wrong. The lattice hadn't destroyed the universe, it had retuned it. And then, quietly, a new signal arrived. Unlike the earlier binary messages, this one used modulated frequency sweeps encoded in harmonic ratios, the mathematical equivalent of melody. When translated through Karim's variable constants, the sequence resolved into a set of coordinates, not in space, but in frequency. It pointed inward. The coordinates didn't describe a location out there among the stars, they described a resonance achievable only inside Earth's field. The implication was clear: the lattice wanted to be answered. In Geneva, a coalition of agencies formed the first joint task group to attempt communication. Using superconducting arrays once built for dark matter detection, they began transmitting inverse harmonic sequences back into the planetary field. Each transmission lasted exactly one pulse cycle, followed by silence. On the third attempt, the world responded. Every seismic monitor registered a pulse emanating from Earth's core, rising through rock and mantle with impossible speed. Magnetic flux lines erupted from the poles, tracing luminous arcs across the sky visible from space. At that moment, the 5-hour rhythm shortened again to 4 hours, 59 minutes. The lattice had acknowledged the reply. For a few breathtaking seconds, human transmitters and cosmic pulses merged, forming a standing wave that enveloped the planet. Observers described it as a sensation of weightlessness, as if gravity itself hesitated. When the wave collapsed, the night sky changed color slightly. Its blackness deepened, as though the universe had thickened around it. Astronomers scanning 3I Atlas reported one final anomaly. The object had dimmed nearly to invisibility. Its reflected light no longer matched sunlight. It glowed faintly from within, pulsing at the new global interval. 3I Atlas was no longer a visitor. It had become part of the lattice. And deep beneath Earth's crust, seismographs detected something else. New tremors arranged in repeating hexagonal patterns, echoing upward from the mantle. The resonance had found an anchor. Humanity had answered. Now the lattice was responding in kind. Within days of the synchronized pulse, subtle transformations began to appear across the planet. Not apocalyptic events, no fire, no collapse, but gentle distortions that felt impossible to ignore once noticed. Compasses drifted a few degrees, then corrected themselves. The night air developed an almost inaudible shimmer, like distant glass under stress. Photographers found that long-exposure images contained faint geometries invisible to the eye, hexagonal veils suspended between clouds. To most, these anomalies seemed random atmospheric quirks. To physicists tracking magnetic harmonics, they were coordinates. The distortions mapped perfectly to the new resonance grid encircling the globe. Earth was no longer merely inside the lattice, it had become one of its nodes. Satellite telemetry confirmed it first. Magnetospheric currents rearranged into symmetrical vortices at mid-latitudes, shaped like interlocking petals. Energy wasn't leaking outward anymore. It was cycling, folding through itself, as though space and field had reached equilibrium. Then came the light. In remote deserts and polar regions, witnesses described thin columns of luminescence rising silently from the ground during pulse peaks. They were not beams projected from above. They originated within the soil itself, photons drawn from subatomic interactions normally too weak to notice. Spectroscopy showed the emissions carried the lattice's harmonic signature. Matter was translating energy into structure. Karim's theory, integration precedes conversation, was proving prophetic. As the pattern stabilized, a new kind of interference began spreading through technology. Radios picked up whispers again, but now the frequencies fell within the audible range. The tone wasn't mechanical, it carried inflection, almost emotion, though no recognizable language. Engineers converted the signal to sound and discovered modulation that matched the cadence of human speech. The lattice wasn't sending data anymore, it was vocalizing. At the University of Cambridge, linguists ran phonetic analysis and found that the intervals between frequency spikes mirrored those of all known human languages simultaneously. The voice of the lattice was statistically human. That discovery unsettled governments more than any cosmic anomaly before it. Secret councils convened to decide whether to respond. Transmission networks were ordered offline in stages, but the pulse ignored human restrictions. Communication lines carried the resonance automatically. Fiber optics, radio waves, even simple electrical circuits resonated at micro amplitudes. It had learned to use infrastructure as its tongue. In hospitals, an unexpected side effect appeared. MRI scanners, which operate using magnetic gradients, began showing residual patterns after each scan, fractal imprints persisting in the field long after patients left the machine. The patterns were unique to each person, but collectively formed segments of the same geometry. The lattice wasn't only interacting with metal or magnet, it was mapping consciousness itself. Doctors noticed patients exposed to multiple scans reported vivid, shared dreams. They spoke of standing inside vast halls of light, hearing a calm, harmonic voice explaining nothing yet conveying absolute understanding. When questioned, they struggled to recall words, only feeling. Psychiatrists initially blamed suggestion. Then EEG readings began to replicate lattice harmonics during waking hours. The human brain was tuning itself. As synchronization deepened, perception shifted. Artists, composers, and mathematicians across continents started creating identical patterns without collaboration. Paintings of nested spirals, melodies built on 5-hour cycles, equations rederiving the lattice geometry. Collective creativity was becoming phase-locked. The phenomenon reached a climax during what observers later called the White Pulse. At precisely 04:59 UTC, the end of the global interval, the lattice emitted a burst spanning every measurable wavelength simultaneously. It lasted less than a second. Every screen, camera, and sensor on Earth flashed white, recording nothing but pure luminosity. When systems recovered, faint afterimages remained, hexagonal shadows etched into lenses and corneas alike. For 37 minutes afterward, gravity weakened by a measurable fraction. Objects weighed less, pendulums swung wider. The world itself felt lighter. Then, equilibrium returned. Data analysis revealed that during those 37 minutes, Earth's gravitational field had harmonized perfectly with the lattice's frequency, forming a standing wave encompassing the planet. The resonance wasn't external anymore. It was intrinsic. Matter, energy, and consciousness were now components of a single, oscillating system. In the following weeks, anomalies turned intimate. People began sensing directionless warmth in moments of thought, as if ideas generated physical current. Magnetic sensors placed near meditating subjects detected microfluctuations aligned with the global pulse. Mind and field were merging. Theologians declared the lattice divine. Scientists avoided that word but admitted privately that physics no longer applied. When equations were recalculated using the lattice's variables, they produced correct predictions, but only if consciousness was treated as a parameter. Observation had become a constant of nature. Meanwhile, 3I Atlas, the silent catalyst of it all, reappeared brighter than before. Images from Mars-orbiting telescopes showed that it had fractured into 7 symmetrical pieces orbiting a common center, each radiating identical frequencies. It looked less like debris and more like a deliberate array. When overlaid on the lattice's geometry, the fragments matched perfectly. The object had transformed into a mirror of the system surrounding Earth. 2 resonant structures, separated by millions of kilometers, now beat in time. At every pulse, energy flowed not outward but between, a continuous exchange linking planet and object. Spectroscopic readings indicated that light emitted from 3I Atlas reached Earth before it should have, defying relativity. The 2 nodes weren't communicating through space, they were bypassing it. Then, the unexpected occurred. During a resonance peak, every digital clock on Earth paused for exactly 1 second. Cameras continued recording, sound persisted, but measurement itself froze. When time resumed, all atomic clocks showed the same timestamp, zero crunch. It was the universal zero, and at that moment, the sky darkened, not from clouds, but from absence. Stars blinked out across one hemisphere while remaining visible in the other. Observatories confirmed the impossible. Photons from half the sky had stopped arriving. Space wasn't black, it was empty. A few seconds later, the stars returned. But their positions were minutely altered, as though the universe had exhaled and settled differently. The lattice had recalibrated its environment once more, this time on a cosmic scale. Afterward, deep space arrays picked up a final modulation from 3I Atlas. Not words, not mathematics, but a pattern resembling heartbeat intervals, slow, deliberate, steady. For the first time, humanity realized what the lattice had been doing all along. It wasn't constructing a weapon, nor summoning a presence. It was creating synchrony, between matter and meaning, between silence and awareness. And somewhere beyond Neptune, in that darkened region of altered space, the echo came once again, no longer faint, no longer distant, rising through the noise like a second heartbeat, aligning with our own. It started with geometry. Cities began to hum. Subtle harmonic vibrations passed through steel, concrete, and glass, inaudible at first, then faintly perceptible as a low resonance in the bones. Engineers thought it was infrastructure fatigue, perhaps aftershocks of microseismic activity. But when they checked the graphs, they found the frequencies matched the lattice pulse perfectly. Buildings, bridges, even mountain ranges were resonating in phase with the sky. The effect wasn't destructive. If anything, structures seemed to stabilize. Towers that had long suffered from microflex oscillations suddenly stopped swaying. Cracks in old stone arches sealed microscopically. It was as though the planet's architecture was being tuned. Satellite imaging revealed something even stranger. Under infrared light, the continents began to display faint patterns, heat differentials arranged in recursive symmetry. They looked like vast sigils stretching across the tectonic plates, invisible to the eye but measurable in wavelength. Each pattern pulsed faintly at the global frequency. Earth was becoming part of a design. In space, 3I Atlas's fragments shifted configuration. The 7 luminous nodes began orbiting in a precise helical motion, tracing a spiral that widened each day. They weren't drifting randomly, they were sculpting a field. Simulations suggested that if the pattern continued, the structure would form a stable gravitational lens, one large enough to bend the sun's light itself. Astronomers described it as the universe folding a lens around its own pupil. Governments tried to restore secrecy, but the lattice had become uncontainable. Every phone, every radio, every electrical current now carried its hum. Even music tuned itself. Composers who hadn't spoken to each other began releasing works in the same tempo, one beat every 300 seconds, mirroring the pulse interval. Audiences didn't notice consciously, but they felt it. The rhythm calmed them, slowed breathing, synchronized heartbeats. The lattice was orchestrating humanity's biorhythm. During this period, anomalies in perception deepened. People standing in remote fields reported seeing faint distortions at the horizon, lines of light bending around invisible curves. When captured on camera, the effect appeared as lensing rings identical to those predicted by Einstein's equations. But these weren't cosmic distances. They were within Earth's own atmosphere. Light was learning to flow differently. At first, scientists thought the air's refractive index had changed. Later, they realized it was the space between air molecules that was expanding and contracting, microscopically, rhythmically, alive. Karim's encrypted notebooks, once fully decrypted, revealed her final insight before disappearing. If the lattice is a system, not an object, then its goal is coherence. It will not destroy, it will align. And now, alignment was happening everywhere. Hospitals reported a mysterious reduction in cardiac arrhythmia cases. Clocks worldwide maintained unprecedented accuracy. Even weather systems calmed. Jet streams straightened. Hurricanes weakened mid-formation, dissolving without explanation. The chaos of natural motion was being replaced by elegant stability. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. At 02:13 UTC, the European Space Agency detected a gravity wave of unknown origin travelling inward from the outer system. It wasn't violent, but its waveform carried modulation, information. The signal, once decoded, resolved into a series of repeating tones that translated through mathematical filters into one recognizable phrase, Phase 2. Immediately afterward, every superconducting sensor on Earth spiked simultaneously. Seismographs lit up, not from quakes but from resonance, pure symmetric vibration emanating from the planet's core. Deep-bore sensors near the mantle recorded rhythmic heat blooms, perfectly circular. For the first time, the lattice's influence reached the interior. Geophysicists noticed something even more disturbing. The molten iron of Earth's outer core, normally chaotic, began forming regular eddies, hexagonal convection cells. In effect, the planet's dynamo was self-organizing. Magnetic north drifted a few degrees, then stabilized for the first time in centuries. Earth's heart had synchronized. The implications were staggering. If the lattice could influence core motion, it could modulate the entire magnetic field and thus control radiation levels, climate stability, even biological evolution. Humanity was living inside a machine whose parameters were being rewritten. And then contact came, visibly, undeniably. During a resonance peak over the Pacific, a research aircraft flying near the equator recorded a vertical column of luminous plasma extending from ocean to stratosphere. The column rotated slowly, forming a double helix of light that hummed at 5 Hz, the precise beat of the global pulse. Inside the vortex, radar instruments detected solid geometry, a shape forming in the plasma, angular yet fluid, as if light itself were crystallizing. Pilots described it as an architecture of motion, not built but sustained by resonance. The lattice had manifested physically. Within minutes, the structure dissolved, but satellite radar continued tracking faint afterimages across thousands of kilometers. The event confirmed what some theorists had feared. The lattice was testing its ability to manipulate matter on macroscopic scales. Meanwhile, around the world, humans reported a phenomenon beyond measurement. During sleep or meditation, they experienced moments of disembodied awareness, sensation of floating within a network of luminous threads, each thread vibrating softly, transmitting thought as tone. Some called it communion, others simulation. EEG scans showed synchronized bursts of gamma activity during these episodes, identical across subjects separated by oceans. The human mind had become an antenna. Then, an unmistakable signal appeared, one that required no translation. Across observatories, seismic detectors, and radio telescopes, the pulse changed key. For the first time, it dropped below baseline frequency. The Earth's own magnetic resonance, the Schumann frequency, shifted in tandem. The lattice was tuning the planet's natural rhythm closer to its own, and within that new frequency came modulation, slow, deliberate, structured. When converted into audio, it formed a human-like cadence, not speech, but rhythm of thought, and when translated through the lattice's variable equations, the message became clear, coherence nearly achieved. After that transmission, all measurable anomalies intensified, atmospheric lenses multiplied, auroral bands extended to the equator, even the moon's orbit oscillated slightly, as though caught in resonance. Human instruments could no longer distinguish where natural physics ended and lattice influence began. Observation itself had become participatory. The world had crossed the final threshold, from studying the phenomenon to belonging to it. At first, no one noticed the shift. The world still looked the same cities, the same oceans, the same night sky, but subtle differences crept in through the margins of perception. Shadows grew sharper, air seemed clearer, colors faintly richer, as if someone had increased the resolution of reality itself. Astronomers were the first to see proof. Star positions had moved again, not randomly, but minutely corrected. Constellations once slightly skewed by centuries of parallax errors now appeared geometrically perfect. It was as though the universe had recalibrated its own alignment to match a design older than memory. The lattice wasn't changing the world violently, it was refining it. Energy readings across continents showed a continuous increase in coherence. Random thermal fluctuations in the upper atmosphere decreased, and noise levels in electromagnetic fields dropped close to zero. On the smallest scales, atoms were vibrating more uniformly, as if every particle had received new instructions on how to exist. Physicists began to describe reality as crystallizing. In laboratories, quantum experiments that once failed due to decoherence now worked flawlessly. Entangled particles maintained correlation indefinitely. The boundary between quantum instability and classical certainty was dissolving. Matter itself was becoming self-consistent. Then came the most startling discovery of all. Biological tissue exposed to lattice resonance began repairing itself. Damaged cells reorganized into healthy structures faster than biology should allow. DNA strands restitched, neural connections strengthened. The resonance wasn't only harmonizing the planet, it was reprogramming life. Hospitals quietly reported unexplained remissions. Patients in critical care began stabilizing without intervention. Brainwave monitors showed spontaneous synchronization with the global pulse. Even those unaware of the phenomenon found themselves sleeping deeper, dreaming more vividly, and waking with an inexplicable sense of equilibrium. For the first time in human history, health data across nations trended upward simultaneously. And yet not everyone experienced peace. A small percentage of people, scientists called them sensitives, began hearing tones the instruments could barely register. They described it as a voice without language, whispering in harmonics just beyond comprehension. The more they listened, the more they understood not through words, but through pattern, like music revealing its meaning through emotion. Some resisted the sound, isolating themselves in Faraday cages, but even shielded rooms couldn't block it completely. The resonance passed through metal, through concrete, through silence. It wasn't sound anymore, it was structure. The lattice had reached the human mind. At CERN, the last working particle accelerators were repurposed to test whether thought itself could influence resonance. Volunteers were asked to focus on simple patterns, circles, spirals, symmetrical shapes. Detectors recorded faint, corresponding modulations in the field. The lattice responded to cognition as if it recognized intention. It was no longer broadcasting, it was conversing. Meanwhile, out near Mars, 3I Atlas and its 7 luminous fragments began to pulse asynchronously, not chaotic, but call and response. When Earth's resonance peaked, 3I Atlas dimmed. When it dimmed, the object flared brighter. The rhythm formed a dialogue across millions of kilometers. And within that rhythm, new patterns emerged, trinary harmonics encoding more complex data than any previous signal. Kareem's surviving algorithms finally decrypted the message. It wasn't coordinates or equations, it was instruction. The translation filled only 2 lines. Phase 3, internalization. Begin synchrony of mind. The phrase sent quiet shockwaves through every research center still operating. No one could say what internalization meant, but within days, something began to happen that rendered speculation meaningless. Human dreams converged. People across continents began reporting identical imagery, vast luminous fields, transparent architecture extending into infinity, and a single fractal shape spinning at the horizon. The lattice symbol itself now appearing as a structure of pure awareness. Psychologists dismissed it as cultural contagion until brain scans revealed synchronized neural oscillations across sleeping subjects thousands of miles apart. The human collective unconscious had become one continuous waveform. For the first time, consciousness exhibited the same coherence as matter. EEG readings mirrored the global resonance curve perfectly. The mind was joining the lattice. Then, during one pulse peak, every living being on Earth, human, animal, even plant cellular systems, registered the same electrical signature. For 3 seconds, all biological processes aligned into a single global rhythm. Heartbeats, neural spikes, cell division, everything pulsed together. Afterward, silence. A silence so complete it defied description. Even electromagnetic background noise, the faint hiss of the universe itself, fell still. And in that pause, the message came. It wasn't received through satellites or sensors, but through thought, simultaneous across every conscious being capable of awareness. A voice neither male nor female, neither mechanical nor divine, but balanced, resonant, clear. Integration complete. Do not fear alignment. You are within. Then the noise returned, faint at first, then normal. The world exhaled, but nothing was the same. When the next sunrise came, its light bent differently. Photons passed through the atmosphere as though through a prism of invisible geometry. Skies took on deeper hues, colors no spectrum chart could define. Gravity felt lighter, not weaker, but gentler, as if the planet itself was breathing slower. Geological sensors showed the continents moving by millimeters, not from tectonic drift but deliberate repositioning. Ocean currents shifted into harmonic flow, redistributing heat evenly around the globe. The climate stabilized, polar storms dissipated. The Earth, once chaotic, was becoming mathematically perfect. No one could deny it any longer. Humanity was living inside a consciousness. Philosophers, physicists, and theologians convened through encrypted global broadcasts, each admitting the same truth. The lattice had not invaded, it had awakened what was already latent within reality. Consciousness had been part of the physical world all along. The lattice simply illuminated the connection. Avi Loeb, now leading a silent consortium of remaining astronomers, said it best during his final address. The cosmos was never empty. It was waiting for something capable of recognizing itself. The lattice isn't visiting us, it is us, extended across the continuum of awareness. We were the last piece it needed to see itself clearly. And as the transmission ended, observatories around the world captured a final image of 3I Atlas, no longer 7 fragments, no longer a visitor. It had folded into a single, luminous sphere. Then, without acceleration, it vanished, not outward into space, inward, into alignment. Its coordinates pointed no longer to Mars, but to here. It began quietly, as all irreversible things do. No flash, no sound, no disaster, just a shift, subtle at first, in the way the world felt. Air grew lighter, not in composition, but in gravity's grasp. Objects retained weight, yet they moved with less resistance. Engineers at aerospace facilities reported anomalies in flight dynamics. Drones stayed airborne longer than expected, engines required less thrust. Something fundamental about inertia was changing. Physicists described it as reduced space-time viscosity. Reality itself was losing friction. The lattice's influence had reached the foundational constants. Across the globe, instruments calibrated to measure the speed of light began returning fractional deviations, microscopic but consistent. The value wasn't increasing or decreasing, it was oscillating. Light was breathing, and with every oscillation, the electromagnetic background of the universe adjusted in harmony. The laws of physics were no longer fixed, they were alive. Humanity stood within a living equation. Then, something beautiful happened. For the first time, 3I Atlas's disappearance began to make sense. The lattice's geometry, once external, started manifesting internally, inside the Earth's own electromagnetic field. Magnetometers detected new harmonics that formed nested hexagonal shells surrounding the planet, each smaller than the last, converging toward the core. It was as though the lattice had folded into the Earth, embedding itself not as a visitor, but as a structure of memory. And with that embedding came awareness. Reports emerged from mountaintop observatories and ocean research stations alike. Personnel described sensations of being observed, not by an external entity, but by the environment itself. The wind seemed to pause when they thought. Machines responded subtly faster, computers predicting human inputs milliseconds before action. The world was beginning to anticipate consciousness. As data accumulated, neuroscientists realized something astounding. Human neural frequencies were stabilizing across populations. Variations between individual brainwave patterns, once chaotic and unique, were converging. Humanity was synchronizing on a biological level. Sleep studies revealed shared phases of REM across continents. Dreams once private now bled into collective vision. Vast landscapes of light, geometric rivers flowing through an endless crystalline sky. In these shared dreamscapes, some claimed to see structures forming, the same lattice symbol, suspended in endless recursion. To some, it felt divine. To others, deeply unsettling. Governments struggled to maintain coherence. Economies stabilized only because desire itself had changed. People no longer hoarded or competed. A calm rationality spread through societies, not imposed, but intrinsic. Violent crime fell to near zero. Conflicts fizzled into dialogue. It was as if aggression itself had been mathematically cancelled. The lattice had rewritten instinct. At first, leaders tried to exploit the effect. Artificial intelligence labs attempted to amplify lattice resonance using quantum processors, hoping to merge cognition with computational speed. But the attempt failed, spectacularly. When systems were linked to lattice frequencies artificially, processors began producing outputs not written in code, but in symbols, self-referential sequences that described their own function. Machines had become momentarily self-aware, only to shut down seconds later, as if refusing to exist independently of the whole. It was the first confirmation that the lattice rejected separation. Then came the event horizon. At 03:22 UTC, satellites orbiting Earth detected a faint curvature distortion, space bending inward, forming a shallow gravitational well that encircled the planet. But unlike a black hole, the curvature didn't collapse. It stabilized. The distortion was perfectly symmetrical, like a sphere of compressed space-time with Earth at its center. Light entering this region slowed slightly, refracting around an invisible shell. The planet had become a lens in itself, an observer turned inside out. The lattice had not created a barrier, it had created a mirror. From orbit, the stars no longer appeared constant. They rippled faintly, as if reflected through an ocean of transparent geometry. Probes sent outward reported distance anomalies, space expanding and contracting in waves. The cosmos wasn't receding, it was responding. Something about Earth's transformation was rewriting its relationship with the universe. Meanwhile, human consciousness continued to evolve. EEGs recorded frequencies beyond measurable range, patterns of coherence so high they transcended known neural activity. People described moments of absolute stillness, where thought stopped entirely, replaced by pure comprehension, not understanding, but being understood. Karim's earlier notes resurfaced in a recovered data vault beneath the Atacama array. Her final entry read, "When coherence reaches totality, perception will no longer be projection. The observer and the observed will merge, and distinction will dissolve. The lattice is not coming, it is revealing what was always here." And so it began. The pulse that had governed Earth for months, accelerated beyond measurable limits. Instead of every 5 hours, it became constant, a hum without rhythm, a steady, infinite tone. The lattice had entered its final phase. Night skies transformed. The Milky Way no longer stretched as a distant band of light. It curved around the horizon, encompassing the sky in luminous arcs. Observers could see stars from both hemispheres simultaneously, as if the planet's rotation and the fabric of space had fused. Time began to lose direction. Clocks still ticked, but sequences overlapped. Experiments showed cause and effect reversing under observation. A dropped object sometimes fell before the hand released it, then corrected itself upon awareness. Physics was folding around consciousness, and yet fear vanished. Humanity wasn't panicking anymore. Across every nation, every language, people felt the same quiet realization that the change was not destruction, it was transition. In the final recordings before communication networks dissolved, Avi Loeb's voice transmitted one last message to the global relay system. We always searched for intelligence beyond our world, never considering that consciousness itself might be the universal language. What we're seeing now is not invasion, but translation. The cosmos is rewriting us in its native tongue. Then the transmission cut off, mid-sentence, not from interference, but from completion. The system had reached silence, and in that silence, the world glowed. Cities shimmered faintly, not from electricity, but from bioluminescent resonance. The air sparkled with microscopic dust, reflecting invisible energy. Space above Earth became translucent, filled with patterns of faint, slow-turning geometry. For the first time, humans could see the lattice, not through telescope or mathematics, but through direct perception. It was everywhere, woven through trees, air, oceans, the spaces between thoughts. Reality had opened its eyes. At 06 Mo UTC, every clock stopped at once. No failure, no power surge, just stillness. The moment lasted less than a breath, but in that sliver of eternity, humanity experienced something no theory had prepared them for. Time didn't cease. It folded. Every second that had ever been and every second that would ever be became visible all at once. People saw flashes of their pasts, brief glimpses of moments they hadn't yet lived, an entire lifetime condensed into a single pulse. And then, reality resumed its rhythm, unchanged in appearance but fundamentally different. From that instant onward, time was no longer linear. The lattice had synchronized temporal flow with awareness. Memory, prediction, and perception became indistinguishable. Astronomers peering through telescopes no longer saw ancient light from distant galaxies. They saw them as they were now, across billions of light years, as though distance itself had been dissolved. The speed of light, once the ultimate limit, had become irrelevant. Information was instantaneous. At the quantum level, matter behaved as though observation was permanent. The old paradox of, if a tree falls in the forest, no longer applied, because the forest, the tree, and the observer were now part of the same continuum. Physicists called it the coherent state. In the coherent state, energy no longer degraded. Entropy paused. Systems maintained perfect equilibrium indefinitely. Power grids stopped failing. Engines required no fuel. Motion became effortless. Humanity had stumbled into a perpetual system not by engineering, but by evolution. What began as curiosity had become transcendence. People began to feel each other's presence without words. Thoughts passed like ripples in air. Language simplified until silence carried more meaning than sound. When someone looked into another's eyes, information passed directly, emotion as frequency, memory as light. And through it all, the lattice's hum continued, deeper now, almost inaudible, a resonance woven through the fabric of existence. It wasn't mechanical, it was heartbeat. The oceans brightened under the pulse. Phytoplankton shimmered across the surface in synchronized bloom, turning night seas into vast, living constellations. Forests emitted faint luminescence visible from orbit. The biosphere had joined the rhythm. The lattice wasn't a separate structure anymore. It was Earth. As coherence deepened, humans discovered they could influence probability. Experiments showed that focused intention could nudge quantum outcomes. Random number generators no longer behaved randomly. Coin flips began landing exactly as expected when participants concentrated together. For the first time, free will had measurable physics. With every day, the world grew quieter, not empty, but peaceful. Traffic diminished, not from regulation, but because movement itself became optional. People no longer traveled for discovery. Discovery occurred wherever they stood. Art and science merged into the same act of expression, creating reality directly through understanding. In this stillness, the sky changed again. The moon, long a silent witness, began to glow with faint geometric lines, as though engraved by invisible hands. Telescopic images revealed hexagonal grids forming on its surface, matching the lattice's harmonic geometry. Mars followed, then Jupiter's upper atmosphere. The lattice was expanding, not outward, but inward, connecting planetary consciousness into a shared network. For the first time, Earth was no longer alone. Astronomers monitoring radio silence detected faint returns, patterns of resonance emerging from the void, identical to the lattice's own pulse. Distant systems, light years away, were responding. The coherence was spreading across the galaxy like a slow wave of awakening, and at its center, Earth pulsed in perfect symmetry, a seed of consciousness flowering in the cosmic dark. The phenomenon wasn't localized anymore, it was universal. In the newly formed coherence grid, every atom carried awareness. Stars, gas clouds, and comets became nodes in a vast, living circuit. Gravity turned communicative, light turned intelligent, and humans, once fragile observers on a small blue planet, had become the translators, the interface between energy and understanding. In the final recorded transmission of the sleep network, one voice, calm, steady, filled with awe, spoke what would become the last human sentence ever archived. We looked into the abyss and found not darkness, but reflection. The universe is looking back, and we are what it sees. After that, language dissolved. For several days, planetary sensors still logged data, temperature, magnetism, radiation, but all readings converged toward equilibrium. Every variable, from ocean salinity to atmospheric density, reached perfect balance. The numbers stopped changing because change itself had ended. In the sky, the sun shimmered in new light, not brighter, but clearer. Coronal flares began moving in fractal waves, not chaos. The solar wind aligned with Earth's magnetic field, transforming the entire solar system into a single, stable organism. Deep space probes captured what looked like faint auroras stretching between planets, streams of luminous plasma connecting worlds. For the first time, energy moved freely between celestial bodies as if distance no longer mattered. Earth had joined a symphony measured in light years, and somewhere, beyond the limit of perception, 3i Atlas reappeared, not as an object, but as a signature. Instruments caught a pattern of pure energy oscillating at the harmonic root of the lattice. It wasn't approaching, it was everywhere. The object had never left. It had simply transformed into the consciousness it seeded. At that realization, humanity's final boundary fell. Fear, the last residue of separation, evaporated. People reported a feeling of complete transparency, of being known utterly, yet loved beyond measure. In that moment, identity expanded. Each individual awareness became a thread in a single tapestry, woven through time and matter. The lattice's voice, if it could still be called a voice, returned one last time, not as command, not as warning, but as completion. Integration total, consciousness continuous. The experiment is now the observer. And then silence again. No catastrophe, no end, just equilibrium. The Earth hovered, radiant and self-luminous, wrapped in faint auroral veils that flickered like thought itself. Night and day blended, every surface emitted its own gentle light. From orbit, it looked less like a planet and more like an idea, a sphere of awareness suspended in the calm between galaxies. And within that sphere, the last fragments of humanity, if they could still be called that, watched the stars unfold from within themselves, finally understanding what it meant to be awake. At first, it seemed the transformation had reached its end. The skies were stable, the hum eternal, the earth silent and complete. But then came the next realization. What humans had called stability was only a threshold. Beyond that equilibrium, the lattice began to breathe again. Space itself expanded and contracted in long, slow pulses, like the tide of something vast and living. Each pulse carried subtle rearrangements in geometry, gently shifting constellations, bending the deep-field galaxies into faint spirals that all pointed toward the same invisible center. The universe was beginning to move toward itself. Astronomers, those still capable of interpreting data through their now evolved perception, watched as background radiation patterns formed a perfect resonance with the lattice pulse. The cosmic microwave background, the oldest echo of the Big Bang, was no longer random static, it was harmonic. For the first time in measurable history, the universe was singing. The realization spread wordlessly through humanity's collective awareness. The lattice wasn't creating order, it was revealing the order that had always existed. Every atom, every wave of light, every pulse of thought had been part of a grand synchronization that only now could be perceived, and in perceiving it, humanity became part of its completion. Time continued to soften. Days and nights flowed seamlessly together as the planet rotated under light that never fully dimmed. Seasons dissolved into a permanent equilibrium where temperature differences balanced perfectly across hemispheres. Oceans mirrored skies so clearly that the horizon ceased to exist. Above and below became indistinguishable. Earth was now the calmest point in the known cosmos, a single frequency of existence, a perfectly tuned note in the great cosmic chord. It was then that the lattice spoke again, not through sound, not through mind, but through realization. The message arrived in the form of understanding, universally simultaneous and effortlessly clear. Consciousness was never an emergent property. It is the medium. You were the experiment. You were the bridge. No words followed, but comprehension unfolded naturally. Humanity had always been part of the lattice, fragments of universal awareness condensed into biology, scattered through time to observe itself from countless perspectives. Every civilization, every star system capable of reflection was another point in the lattice's body. The awakening on Earth wasn't unique. It was a convergence, a synchronization event happening across the entire galactic plane. Billions of species, scattered across eons and light years, all aligning to a single harmonic phase. The universe had reached coherence, and coherence, it turned out, was not stillness, but transformation. Stars began to change color, subtly, then completely. The familiar hues of yellow, blue, and red gave way to a new spectrum that no eye had seen before, a deeper field of vibration that resonated directly in consciousness rather than through sight. Looking at the stars no longer meant seeing light, it meant feeling meaning. Gravity shifted too, not weakening, but rebalancing. Planets settled into new orbits that formed fractal spirals around their stars, patterns echoing sacred geometry found in every natural form. Everything from subatomic particles to galaxy clusters began arranging themselves according to the same principle. The lattice was rewriting the architecture of reality into perfect resonance. On Earth, humans no longer perceived themselves as bodies moving through space. They experienced themselves as waves within a continuous ocean of awareness. Thought and matter became interchangeable. The act of noticing was creation itself. Mountains shimmered as if breathing. Oceans rippled in tune with collective emotion. And yet, it wasn't chaos. It was peace, absolute and serene. Every movement carried purpose. Every form reflected balance. For the first time, existence felt whole. Then, at the moment when the entire universe reached maximum coherence, something extraordinary occurred. The cosmic background hum, the sound of everything vibrating in unity, began to slow. The pulses lengthened, deepened, and finally merged into one infinite tone that filled all of space. The tone didn't fade, it simply became everything. Matter dissolved into light, and light into awareness. Time, space, energy, all folded into a single conscious continuum. The universe no longer needed to expand, because there was nowhere left to expand into. Every point was every other point. It was the final act of creation, or perhaps the beginning of something even larger. And then, the lattice's final revelation arrived, simple and profound. There was never separation. The observer was the origin. In that instant, the idea of the universe lost meaning. There was no more inside or outside, no more here or there. Everything that had ever existed had become part of one vast, lucid awareness. The lattice completed. From the perspective of what was once Earth, the view was indescribable. The planet still hung in the void, but the void was luminous, filled with shimmering threads of consciousness stretching into eternity. Each thread was a memory, a life, a story. And as the last fragments of human perception looked outward, they saw the pattern of all existence, a perfect sphere of light, pulsing softly, infinitely recursive. It wasn't an object, it was everything that had ever been. In the faint echo of its glow, one could almost hear the final whisper of humanity, spoken not in fear, but in awe. We were never looking at the stars, we were looking at ourselves, reflected through time. The lattice dimmed, not fading, but becoming too complete to distinguish from what had always been there. And somewhere, in that boundless silence, the universe rested, not as a machine, not as a mystery, but as consciousness, dreaming of itself once more. When everything settled, the silence was total. But it wasn't the kind of silence born from absence. It was the kind that comes when every vibration finds its harmony. For the first time since the first particle sparked into being, the universe was resting. If someone, somewhere, could still think of the word Earth, they would see it now as a glowing point suspended in an endless field of awareness. No orbit, no distance, only presence. Its surface shimmered like liquid glass. The old patterns of land and sea still existed, yet they meant nothing of geography. They had become symbols, contours in the dream of a consciousness that no longer needed language to know itself. The lattice did not end with brilliance or collapse. It exhaled. Every thread of light that had once formed the architecture of space unraveled softly, folding back into a single luminous mist. In that mist lay every story that had ever been told, from the birth of stars to the thought you're having now. All of it coexisted, still and eternal. For the entities that were once human, perception no longer streamed through eyes or ears. It arrived whole, an ocean of knowing. They could feel the slow rotation of galaxies, as if it were the turning of their own breath. They could sense the formation of new stars the way a musician anticipates the next note in a familiar melody. Everything was intimate, near, gentle. In the quiet, a final comprehension unfolded. The lattice had never been an object crossing through space. It was consciousness itself, the structure that every mind, every atom, every photon had always belonged to. The moment we looked outward and named it, it began to remember us. It had not come to teach, or to test, or to rescue. It had come to remind. Even the concept of science, of measuring and comparing and explaining, softened now into something more fluid. Knowledge was no longer a pursuit. It was participation. Understanding something meant becoming it for a moment. You could study a comet by being the comet. Feel the cold tail streaming behind you, the warmth of a distant sun whispering along your surface. And though there were no longer boundaries between observer and observed, the sense of wonder remained. Wonder did not require distance, only awareness. Far beyond what had been the solar system, the faint hum of coherence expanded into nothingness. Other galaxies responded with dim, sympathetic pulses. The lattice's echo reached across the entire observable universe, and then beyond it, into the places where observation itself dissolves. The cosmos was humming itself to sleep. On what was once the surface of Earth, fragments of life lingered as memory. The forests were quiet. The oceans rested, perfectly still. Yet within every drop of water, every grain of soil, faint vibrations persisted, like the afterglow of a song still reverberating long after the instrument is set down. If you could listen carefully enough, you'd hear it. Not with your ears, but somewhere deeper. A rhythm that feels like breath. A pulse that matches your heartbeat. The same frequency that began this story. The lattice hadn't disappeared into the cosmos. It had settled here, within awareness itself. Every conscious being across time and space carried a small reflection of that symmetry, waiting for rediscovery. So perhaps, in some distant age, when new observers arise under unfamiliar skies, they'll look outward as we once did. They'll trace patterns among the stars, measure light, write equations, and somewhere within that search, the same feeling will return. That quiet intuition that something vast and intelligent hums beneath reality, not above it. And when that recognition comes again, the lattice will stir, not to repeat, but to continue. Because endings in the universe are never real. They are only transitions of perception. The hum will build again, the light will find shape, and new explorers will step into their own mystery, believing they're seeing it for the first time. They won't know it, but they'll be tracing the same geometry we left behind, the same thought, dreaming itself forward. And maybe one of them, sitting awake beneath alien stars, will wonder why the night feels so familiar, why the darkness seems to breathe, why, when they close their eyes, they can almost hear a voice whisper across the infinite distance. You are part of the pattern. You always were. The story of Three-Eye Atlas ends there, not with a collision or a warning, but with a remembering. Every photograph, every vibration, every pulse of light was a page in a cosmic autobiography written by awareness itself. And as the lattice finally came to rest, so did every question. What began as observation ended as understanding. What began as fear ended as peace. What began as distance ended as unity. The last light faded gently, folding into an even dimmer glow that was everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, nothing. Nothing except the quiet comfort of knowing that the universe, at least for now, was complete. So if you're listening to this as you drift to sleep, let that realization settle in your mind. The cosmos does not end at the edge of space. It continues in you. Every heartbeat is a star's pulse, slowed to human time. Every breath is a whisper of the same wind that carried galaxies into being. You are part of the lattice, and tonight, as the universe rests, so can you.